One suitcase? That's all you have?
It's all I need.
What is that?
Tomorrow changes everything.
Jacob Walker was 41, a senior civil infrastructure engineer in Denver, Colorado. Most people believed he was the kind of husband life quietly overlooked. His wife, Zoe, was convinced he had settled for an ordinary paycheck and an ordinary future. He still drove a 9-year-old Ford Escape, carried the same worn leather messenger bag to work, and packed homemade lunches every morning. What Zoe didn't know was that Jacob had spent the last 4 years quietly buying a future she had never imagined. As he zipped a single black suitcase beside the front door, Zoe laughed. At that exact moment, his phone vibrated with one message, closing confirmed. 9:00 a.m. tomorrow. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, I'd love to know where you're joining us from. Leave a comment with your country and your local time. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel, and if you enjoy slow-burning stories where patience, truth, and preparation speak louder than revenge, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's journey. Because sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one holding the strongest hand. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Highlands Ranch just south of Denver. It looked like dozens of other homes built during the housing boom 2 decades earlier. Fresh mulch lined the flower beds. A silver mailbox stood straight beside the driveway. Every Saturday morning, sprinklers hissed across neatly trimmed grass before the sun climbed over the front range. From the outside, the Walker family looked comfortable. Not wealthy, not struggling, just ordinary. Jacob Walker preferred it that way. Every weekday began at exactly 5:20 a.m. His alarm vibrated once before he reached over and silenced it. He never snoozed it. The bedroom remained dark, while Zoe slept beneath expensive linen sheets she had insisted on buying from a luxury home boutique in Cherry Creek. Jacob quietly dressed in navy work pants, a gray polo embroidered with the logo of Rocky Mountain Infrastructure Group, and steel-toe boots polished enough to last another year. He moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Coffee, oatmeal, turkey sandwich, apple, reusable water bottle. Everything fit neatly into the same insulated lunch bag he had carried for nearly 6 years. He never complained that the zipper occasionally stuck. He simply fixed it with a small tube of graphite lubricant. By 6:05, he was backing his aging Ford Escape out of the driveway. The engine started on the second turn every morning. The cracked leather steering wheel fit naturally into his hands. He could have replaced the vehicle years earlier. He simply chose not to. None of those details seemed important to Zoe anymore. She usually woke around 7. By then, Jacob was already halfway across Denver, reviewing bridge inspection reports before the first construction meeting of the day. Zoe's mornings looked very different. Designer coffee, luxury gym, hair appointment every other Thursday, lunch with clients at upscale restaurants near Union Station. She sold multi-million-dollar homes to executives relocating from California and Texas. Her social media reflected exactly the life she wanted people to believe she lived. Beautiful listings, elegant dinners, champagne celebrations, smiling photographs. What rarely appeared online was Jacob. When he did, he was usually cropped into the corner of a holiday picture. Never the center, never the story. The narrator could see something Jacob never said aloud. He had noticed that change more than a year ago. He simply refused to argue about it. People often assumed silence meant weakness. Jacob understood something different. Silence allowed him to observe. Observation revealed patterns. Patterns eventually became evidence. That habit had followed him since college. While other engineering students rushed through projects, Jacob studied why structures failed instead of simply how they were built. The same patience had quietly entered every part of his life, including his marriage. One Friday evening, Jacob arrived home just before 6. Rain clouds gathered above the foothills west of Denver. He placed his boots beside the garage door, washed the concrete dust from his hands, and noticed the kitchen was empty. The refrigerator contained only a handwritten note, attached by a decorative magnet. Dinner with clients. Don't wait up. Z. He smiled faintly, not because he believed the note, because it matched the previous 3 Fridays almost word for word. He heated leftover chicken soup, ate alone, loaded the dishwasher, folded laundry, vacuumed the living room. At 8:17 p.m., Zoe posted a photograph online. A rooftop cocktail. Downtown Denver skyline. Caption: closing another incredible deal with amazing people. Jacob looked at the picture for exactly 3 seconds. He enlarged it once, then closed the app. The reflection inside the restaurant window revealed 3 wine glasses. The caption mentioned only 2 people. He locked his phone without another thought. Not because he lacked curiosity, because curiosity without proof solved nothing. Saturday morning arrived clear and warm. Zoe finally appeared downstairs wearing white designer sneakers and oversized sunglasses, despite being indoors. "You still have that thing?" she asked casually, nodding toward Jacob's Ford parked outside. Jacob looked through the kitchen window. "The Escape. It belongs in a museum. It still runs. It embarrasses me." He stirred scrambled eggs without looking up. "It gets me to work." Zoe sighed dramatically. "You know what Ryan drives?" Jacob had heard the name before. Ryan Caldwell. She mentioned him more often lately, usually while talking about important investors or developers. "No," Jacob answered. "A new Range Rover." "I'm glad he likes it." She laughed. "You don't get it." Jacob placed breakfast onto a plate. "No? Image matters." He nodded once. "It does." She expected an argument. Instead, he carried his plate to the dining table. The conversation ended there. That frustrated Zoe more than any disagreement ever could. Arguments gave people opponents. Jacob rarely volunteered for that role. Later that afternoon, he spent 4 hours replacing a broken fence panel in the backyard. He measured every board twice, used screws instead of nails, applied weather sealant carefully around each post. Their elderly neighbor, Harold Benson, leaned over the fence. "Looks good, Jacob?" "It'll last." Harold smiled. "You always build things like you're expecting 50 years. Jacob wiped sawdust from his hands. "Things usually last longer when someone plans ahead." Harold laughed. "I wish more people thought that way." Jacob simply smiled. The comment lingered longer than either man realized. Inside the house, Zoe watched from the upstairs window. She shook her head. To her, Jacob spent an entire Saturday fixing a fence because he couldn't imagine anything bigger. She never wondered whether a man capable of planning 50-year structures might also plan his own future. Monday arrived. Jacob attended a transportation planning meeting near the Colorado Department of Transportation headquarters. 20 engineers filled the conference room. One by one, they debated costs, schedules, environmental impact, and drainage revisions. Jacob spoke only twice. Both comments solved problems that had stalled discussion for nearly 40 minutes. After the meeting, his supervisor caught up with him. "You should really apply for director." Jacob smiled politely. "I'm good where I am." "You've turned down that promotion 3 times." "I know." "Most people would kill for it." "I'm not most people." His supervisor laughed. "You've always been impossible to figure out." Jacob only thanked him before walking toward the parking garage. He never explained. Not to coworkers, not to friends, certainly not to Zoe. Because explanations invited questions. Questions invited attention. Attention had a way of ruining carefully built plans. That evening, Jacob arrived home before sunset. The garage was empty. Zoe's white Mercedes was gone. Again. Another note waited on the counter. "Running late. Big client dinner." Jacob placed the note beside yesterday's grocery receipt. He opened the refrigerator, prepared another quiet meal. The television remained off. Outside, summer thunderstorms rolled across the Rockies. Rain tapped steadily against the windows at exactly 9:41 p.m. Jacob's phone buzzed. Not a text. Not a call. A calendar reminder. Meeting confirmed. Tuesday, 7:30 a.m. He acknowledged the notification without changing expression. Whatever occupied tomorrow morning clearly mattered. Yet he showed no excitement. He simply deleted the reminder after memorizing the location. At 10:26 p.m., headlights swept across the living room ceiling. Zoe finally returned. Jacob remained seated in the den, reading a hardcover book on structural load analysis. She seemed surprised to find him awake. "I thought you'd be asleep." "I wasn't tired." She placed her handbag on the kitchen island. "Long dinner." "I'm sure." She hesitated. For barely half a second. It was enough. The scent of unfamiliar men's cologne lingered faintly beneath her expensive perfume. Jacob noticed. He said nothing. Instead, he turned another page. She disappeared upstairs without another word. A few minutes later, Jacob quietly stood and walked toward the front window. Across the street beneath a streetlight, a black luxury SUV remained parked for several seconds before slowly pulling away into the darkness. Jacob watched until its tail lights disappeared around the corner. Only then did he glance at his watch. 10:34 p.m. He remembered the license plate, not because he intended to confront anyone, because details had a way of becoming useful when emotions finally ran out. The first time Jacob Walker refused the promotion, everyone assumed he lacked ambition. The second time, they believed he feared responsibility. By the third offer, people stopped asking. His supervisor filed the paperwork away and joked that Jacob would probably retire from the same office where he had started. Nobody realized the promotion would have required weekly travel across 3 western states. That single condition made it impossible. Not because Jacob disliked traveling, because every Thursday morning for nearly 4 years he had been somewhere else entirely. 4 years earlier, Denver had looked very different. Interest rates were climbing, commercial construction had slowed, developers were postponing projects, investors grew cautious. Rocky Mountain Infrastructure Group had been hired to evaluate a neglected industrial district northeast of downtown Denver. Most engineers treated it as another consulting assignment. Jacob did not. For 3 months, he walked every abandoned street himself. He inspected aging storm drains, measured bridge supports, reviewed underground utility maps dating back to the early 1980s. He spent evenings studying transportation forecasts released by the Colorado Department of Transportation. Then he noticed something everyone else overlooked. The city had quietly approved preliminary expansion plans for 2 major commuter rail connections. No newspaper reported them. No television station discussed them. The information existed only inside public planning documents most people never bothered reading. Jacob read every page. Then he bought a legal pad. Across 12 handwritten pages, he estimated what would happen if the rail expansion received final approval within 5 years. Property values, commercial demand, apartment construction, retail development, utility upgrades. Every calculation pointed toward the same conclusion. The Forgotten District would eventually become one of Denver's most valuable redevelopment corridors. The opportunity wasn't obvious. It required patience. Months later, Jacob attended an engineering coordination meeting where representatives from several private developers gathered around a long conference table. That was the first time he saw Caldwell Urban Development. Ryan Caldwell himself never attended. Instead, a team of executives discussed budgets, zoning restrictions, and environmental mitigation. Near the end of the meeting, one executive casually mentioned that investors were pulling out. The redevelopment looked too risky. Jacob listened without speaking. After everyone left, one older woman remained behind collecting folders. She wore a charcoal business suit and silver reading glasses. Her movements were precise. Nothing hurried, nothing wasted. She introduced herself before Jacob asked. "Margaret Bennett." Jacob shook her hand. "Jacob Walker. I've heard your presentation before." "I don't remember giving one." "You didn't." She smiled faintly. "I read your engineering reports." Jacob nodded politely. "They're thorough." "I try." Margaret slipped several documents into a leather briefcase. "Most engineers describe roads. You described future neighborhoods." Jacob didn't answer. She studied him for a moment. "You've seen something other people haven't." Jacob simply replied, "Possibly." That restrained answer interested her more than certainty would have. 2 weeks later, Margaret called. She invited Jacob to lunch. Not at an expensive steakhouse, not at a downtown club. Instead, they met at a quiet diner in Golden, where construction workers outnumbered executives. Margaret arrived exactly on time. She ordered coffee. Nothing else. Jacob did the same. She placed a folder between them. "Caldwell Urban Development needs engineers." Jacob smiled politely. "I'm already employed." "They don't need another employee." She leaned forward. "They need someone willing to believe in the project." Jacob remained silent. Margaret continued. "They can pay consulting fees." She paused. "Or?" She slid one document toward him. "They can compensate selected contributors with ownership interests." Jacob looked down. Equity participation. Not salary, not bonuses, ownership. The percentage looked tiny. Less than 1%. Most people would have dismissed it immediately. Jacob asked only one question. "What happens if the project fails?" "You lose your investment." "And if it succeeds?" Margaret closed the folder. "You'll never need another promotion." The meeting lasted 26 minutes. Jacob never made a decision that afternoon. Instead, he drove home and began reading. Colorado partnership law, private equity agreements, development financing, tax implications, confidentiality clauses. Every night for nearly 6 weeks, he studied until midnight. When he finally signed the first agreement, he understood every paragraph. No surprises, no assumptions, no emotional decisions, only facts. The investment itself looked unimpressive. He used most of a performance bonus accumulated over several years. Friends thought he had finally replaced his old SUV. Instead, the money disappeared into paperwork no one would ever see. Over the next 4 years, the pattern repeated. Annual bonuses, quarterly dividends from small investments, unused vacation payouts. Every extra dollar quietly purchased additional partnership units whenever opportunities appeared. Jacob never borrowed heavily, never gambled, never chased impossible returns. He simply accumulated ownership one careful step at a time. Margaret handled every transaction personally. Each time they met, it was somewhere ordinary. Public libraries, neighborhood cafes, small law offices away from downtown skyscrapers. She insisted on discretion. Not because anything was illegal, because large development projects attracted unnecessary attention, especially before land values increased. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Jacob arrived at Bennett and Harlow, LLP, carrying his familiar leather messenger bag. The receptionist greeted him by name. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker." "Good afternoon." Margaret waited inside a conference room overlooking downtown Denver. Large architectural drawings covered one wall. Color-coded transportation maps covered another. She handed Jacob several thick folders. The city approved Phase 1. Jacob opened the first document. Official seals, planning signatures, environmental clearances. Everything had become real. Margaret watched quietly. "You expected this?" "I hoped." "There's a difference." Jacob nodded. "There is." She smiled. "Most investors celebrate." "I prefer confirming." Margaret appreciated that answer. She had represented wealthy clients for more than 30 years. Many became excited too early. Jacob never did. She placed another document on the table. Caldwell wants to offer existing partners additional units. Jacob reviewed every page carefully. At the current valuation. Yes. It won't stay this low. No. He signed. Not because prices had already risen, because he believed they eventually would. That decision would later multiply in value beyond anything Zoe imagined possible. Yet nothing changed outside the conference room. Jacob still drove the same Ford Escape, still packed homemade lunches, still mowed his own lawn, still repaired household appliances instead of replacing them. When coworkers bought luxury pickups, Jacob quietly replaced worn brake pads himself. When neighbors remodeled kitchens, Jacob repainted the guest bedroom on weekends. His life looked unchanged, exactly as he intended. One evening, Zoe opened the mailbox while Jacob watered the backyard flowers. She held up another plain white envelope. More paperwork? Jacob glanced over. Probably. You get more legal mail than anyone I know? Mostly signatures. She shrugged. As long as it isn't bills. Jacob smiled. It isn't. She tossed the envelope onto the kitchen counter without another thought. She never opened it, never asked, never wondered why nearly every envelope came from the same law firm. To her, legal correspondence sounded boring. To Jacob, each envelope represented another carefully laid brick in a future no one else could yet see. Months passed, construction permits expanded, new investors entered quietly, land values climbed almost unnoticed. Still, Jacob said nothing. The confidentiality agreement he had signed prohibited discussing project ownership. Even without the agreement, he would have remained silent. Real wealth often arrived long before anyone recognized it. Late one autumn afternoon, Margaret invited him back to her office. She appeared more satisfied than usual. She placed a single folder in front of him. This is the last acquisition opportunity before external financing closes. Jacob reviewed the numbers. The price had already increased. Not dramatically. Enough. He calculated silently, then nodded. I'll take it. Margaret studied him. You realize this will represent nearly everything you've accumulated. I know. You'll be concentrating your future into one project. Jacob closed the folder. I'm concentrating it into preparation. Margaret looked at him for several quiet seconds. Finally, she smiled. Most people invest after everyone believes. You invested before anyone cared. Jacob stood. I've spent my career building things people don't notice until they're finished. Margaret extended her hand. Only one final document remains. Jacob shook it once. Neither of them knew that years later, one black suitcase, one quiet departure, and that final document would become part of the same story. Tuesday morning arrived with low clouds hanging over downtown Denver. Traffic moved slowly along Interstate 25. Construction crews filled the shoulders with orange safety barriers. Jacob Walker left home at 6:10 a.m., as he always did. His lunch bag rested on the passenger seat. Coffee steamed gently inside a stainless steel travel mug. Nothing about the morning suggested it would become important, at least not to anyone watching. Instead of turning toward Rocky Mountain Infrastructure Group, Jacob exited downtown several miles early. He parked beside a quiet brick building near Civic Center Park. The polished brass plaque beside the entrance read, Bennett and Harlow, LLP. He checked his watch. 7:26. 4 minutes early. Margaret Bennett appreciated punctuality. So did Jacob. The receptionist smiled the moment he entered. Good morning, Mr. Walker. Morning. Miss Bennett is expecting you. She escorted him into the same conference room they had used for years. Fresh coffee waited beside a neatly organized stack of documents. Large windows overlooked Denver's skyline. Tower cranes dotted the horizon. Several stood inside the redevelopment district Jacob had first studied years before. Those cranes represented billions of dollars. Most people admired them for their height. Jacob admired them because they confirmed his calculations had been correct. Margaret entered carrying another folder. She looked unusually serious. "Good morning." "Morning." She sat across from him. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, she slid a thick appraisal report across the polished walnut table. "It came in yesterday." Jacob opened the report carefully. Certified commercial valuation, independent appraisal, updated market projections. His eyes moved slowly across the pages. The redevelopment district had appreciated far beyond earlier forecasts. Warehouse blocks, once considered nearly worthless, had become some of the city's most competitive commercial acquisitions. Technology companies had begun leasing office space. Medical research firms purchased entire buildings. Luxury apartment developers competed for remaining parcels. Jacob closed the report. "The numbers are higher." Margaret nodded. 32% higher than the previous valuation. He remained quiet. Most investors would have smiled. Some would have celebrated. Jacob simply absorbed the information. Margaret had expected nothing less. She removed another document. Caldwell Urban Development received 3 acquisition offers. Jacob looked up. Already. They came faster than anyone predicted. Rejected. The first 2. And the third. Margaret folded her hands. The board accepted negotiations. The conference room became completely silent. Jacob understood exactly what those words meant. An acquisition would not simply increase property values, it would convert ownership percentages into actual liquidity. The investment would stop being numbers printed inside legal documents. It would become real money. Margaret watched him carefully. "You've never asked what your position is worth." "I know. Most people ask every month. The answer changes." "It certainly does." She opened the final folder. Several confidential pages remained face down. "Before you read these, I need to remind you that everything remains confidential until closing." "I understand. You cannot discuss it with coworkers." "I won't." "Family." Jacob paused briefly. "I understand." She noticed the hesitation. Only a fraction of a second. Still, after years of representing clients, Margaret rarely missed subtle details. "Everything all right at home?" Jacob considered the question. His answer arrived after several quiet moments. "We've been growing in different directions." Margaret didn't pry. Attorneys survived by recognizing which questions clients wanted answered and which they simply needed acknowledged. She nodded once, then rotated the folder toward him. Jacob read carefully. One paragraph, then another. His ownership percentage had grown much larger than he remembered. Years of reinvested distributions and additional unit purchases had quietly compounded. He performed the calculation mentally, then checked it again, then a third time. He looked back toward Margaret. "I wasn't expecting this." "You should have. I never estimated this high." "You underestimated appreciation." She smiled faintly. "That's one mistake I'm happy to see." Jacob leaned back. Outside the window, another tower crane slowly lifted steel beams toward the 23rd floor of a new office building. He remembered standing on that exact block years earlier when stray weeds pushed through cracked asphalt. Time changed landscapes. Patience changed lives. Margaret continued. "If closing proceeds next month, your proceeds after taxes will comfortably exceed 8 figures." Jacob remained silent. The number echoed quietly through his thoughts, not because of excitement, because of responsibility. He had never chased wealth. He had chased stability. The money simply happened to follow. Margaret slid one final envelope toward him. "I've prepared something else." Jacob opened it. A handwritten list. Financial advisors, estate planning specialists, tax attorneys, private banking contacts. "I thought you might need these." "Thank you." "You don't have to use any of them." I know. But you shouldn't make large decisions alone. Jacob folded the paper carefully. I won't. The meeting ended shortly before 9. As Jacob walked toward the parking garage, his phone vibrated. Zoe. He answered immediately. Hey. Where are you? Downtown. I thought you were at work. I had an appointment. What kind of appointment? Paperwork. Oh. Her voice carried mild disappointment. Not concern, not curiosity. Simply disappointment that his answer sounded ordinary. She changed the subject almost immediately. Don't forget Friday. I haven't. My brokerage is hosting an appreciation dinner. I remember. You'll need something nicer than your usual jacket. I have one. She laughed softly. The navy blazer? Yes. You've had that thing forever. It still fits. Silence settled for a moment. Then Zoe sighed. Jacob. Yes. Try not to embarrass me. He looked through the windshield at rows of parked vehicles, luxury SUVs, electric sports cars, executive sedans. His Ford Escape sat quietly among them. I'll be there. I know. She ended the call. Jacob placed the phone face down. He didn't replay the conversation. He didn't analyze every word. He had heard similar comments often enough that they no longer surprised him. What interested him instead was timing. Zoe had called during one of the most financially significant mornings of his life. Yet she had never asked whether he was all right. Never wondered why he had missed work. Never asked whether he needed anything. Only whether his clothing would meet someone else's expectations. He started the engine. The old SUV rumbled gently before settling into its familiar idle. Across downtown, another luxury vehicle pulled into the underground garage beneath Glass River Realty. Zoe stepped out, wearing cream-colored heels and a tailored camel blazer. She greeted the receptionist warmly before entering the executive conference room. Ryan Caldwell already stood beside the windows overlooking the city. He wore a charcoal Italian suit, perfectly polished shoes, a watch that cost more than Jacob's vehicle. Ryan smiled confidently. Morning, Zoe. Morning. He poured coffee into 2 porcelain cups. You'll love today's announcement. Zoe accepted one. What is it? We're hosting investors from California next month. That sounds promising. It is. Ryan smiled again. Our company is about to become much larger. Zoe's eyes brightened. Expansion. Possibly. He deliberately avoided details. Confidential negotiations prevented him from saying more. Instead, he changed the topic. You still married to the engineer? Zoe rolled her eyes. Barely. Ryan chuckled. He's still driving that old Ford. I've given up trying. Ryan shook his head with amused disbelief. Some people never think bigger. Zoe smiled politely. She didn't defend Jacob. She didn't disagree. The narrator could observe Ryan's confidence, but the narrator never entered his private thoughts. Only his visible behavior, his relaxed posture, his casual assumptions, his certainty that appearances reflected reality. Meanwhile, Jacob drove quietly back toward his engineering office. His phone remained silent, his expression unchanged. Inside his leather messenger bag rested documents worth more than anyone in his office could possibly imagine. By noon, he was standing beside a bridge inspection site, wearing an orange safety vest. A younger engineer named Tyler approached, carrying blueprints. Jacob. Yeah? You still coming to lunch? I brought mine. Tyler laughed. You always do. Jacob smiled. It saves money. Tyler glanced toward the faded lunch bag. You know one of these days you're going to surprise us and buy yourself something expensive. Jacob closed the blueprint tube. Maybe. When? Jacob looked toward the distant skyline where cranes continued reshaping Denver. When the timing is right. Tyler laughed again. That's the most Jacob answer I've ever heard. Jacob only smiled, because for the first time in years, the timing was finally beginning to arrive. Friday arrived colder than expected. A light wind swept through downtown Denver, carrying the smell of fresh concrete from half-finished towers that continued to reshape the skyline. Jacob Walker finished work at precisely 5:14 p.m. He changed out of his reflective safety vest inside the engineering office locker room. From his locker, he removed the navy blazer Zoe had criticized earlier that week. The jacket was nearly 8 years old. The fabric remained clean. The shoulders still fit perfectly. He brushed away a small trace of construction dust before putting it on. Tyler happened to walk past. "You actually own a blazer?" Jacob smiled. "I've owned it for years." Tyler laughed. "I thought you only had work clothes." Jacob picked up his leather messenger bag. "Have a good weekend?" "You too." Outside evening traffic had already begun filling the streets. Jacob drove toward Glass River Realty instead of home. Zoe had texted him earlier. "Meet me downstairs at 6. Don't be late." He arrived 5 minutes early. Her silver luxury crossover already occupied the front parking space. Zoe stood beside it, checking messages on her phone. She looked elegant. An ivory silk dress disappeared beneath a long camel-colored coat. Diamond earrings reflected the fading sunlight. When Jacob parked nearby, she glanced toward his Ford Escape before looking back at him. "You wore the blazer." "I said I would." She walked around him once. "I guess it'll have to do." Jacob simply nodded. She frowned slightly. "You could at least pretend you're excited." "I am." "It doesn't sound like it." "I'm looking forward to spending the evening with you." For a brief second, she softened. Then another vehicle pulled beside the entrance. Ryan Caldwell stepped out first. Behind him came several senior executives from Caldwell Urban Development, along with guests from California. Expensive tailored suits, luxury watches, confident smiles. Ryan spotted Zoe immediately. "There you are." He approached with effortless confidence. "Good evening." Zoe smiled warmly. "Good evening." Ryan then acknowledged Jacob. "Jacob?" "Ryan." They shook hands once. Ryan's grip felt practiced, measured, professional. "So you're the famous engineer?" Jacob smiled politely. "I don't know about famous." Ryan chuckled. "Zoe tells us you're the practical one." Jacob glanced briefly toward his wife. She avoided eye contact. Ryan continued. "Nothing wrong with practical." "Depends on the situation, I suppose." One California investor joined them. "This your husband?" Zoe nodded. "Jacob." The investor extended his hand. "David Morrison. Nice to meet you." David glanced toward Jacob's vehicle. "You drive the Ford?" "I do." "Reliable?" "It has been." The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes before Ryan gestured toward the hotel entrance. "We should head inside." The appreciation dinner occupied the top floor of the Grand Summit Hotel. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked nearly the entire city. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. Servers carried trays of champagne. A jazz trio performed quietly near one corner. Everything about the evening communicated success. Jacob noticed details most guests ignored: emergency exits, structural support columns, fire suppression systems integrated into the ceiling. Years of engineering had trained him to observe buildings differently. Zoe noticed something else entirely. Designer dresses, luxury handbags, custom jewelry, status. The reception began with cocktails. Jacob accepted sparkling water. Ryan accepted bourbon. Several investors clustered together discussing acquisition opportunities across Colorado and Utah. Jacob listened without interrupting. Occasionally, someone asked what he did. "Civil engineer." The answer usually ended the conversation. One investor smiled politely. "Important work." "It keeps roads standing." Then attention shifted elsewhere. Jacob didn't mind. Observation often revealed more than participation. Across the ballroom, Margaret Bennett entered quietly. She wore the same understated charcoal suit she preferred during business meetings. Her arrival attracted almost no attention. Most guests assumed she was simply another attorney attending corporate functions. Ryan noticed her. He walked over with practiced confidence. "Margaret." "Ryan. I wasn't expecting you. I represent clients." "So do we." They exchanged polite smiles. Neither revealed anything significant. Margaret accepted a glass of mineral water before moving toward another group. Her eyes briefly met Jacob's across the ballroom. She acknowledged him with the slightest nod. Nothing more. Confidentiality remained intact. The dinner bell rang shortly afterward. Guests moved toward assigned tables. Zoe looked surprised. "Our names aren't together." Jacob checked the seating card. She was correct. Zoe sat at table 3 with Ryan Caldwell, David Morrison, and several visiting investors. Jacob sat at table 9, beside Margaret Bennett, across from 2 accountants and a transportation consultant. Zoe frowned. Maybe they made a mistake. Ryan glanced toward the cards. No. He smiled. Seating was intentional. Jacob calmly replied, "That's fine." Zoe looked disappointed, not because she wanted to spend time with Jacob, because appearances mattered. People might wonder why husband and wife sat apart. Jacob took his assigned seat without complaint. Margaret quietly unfolded her napkin. "You don't seem bothered." "I'm not." She poured herself water. "I suspected you wouldn't be." The first course arrived. Conversation remained light. Transportation forecasts, commercial lending, municipal infrastructure, subjects Jacob genuinely understood. Margaret occasionally asked his opinion. "What do you think about the Western Freight Corridor?" "It'll require expansion sooner than projected." "Why?" "Distribution demand." She nodded. "The reports suggest the same." Across the ballroom, Zoe watched. She had never seen Jacob contribute confidently inside conversations involving executives. At home, he rarely discussed work. Here, he answered technical questions naturally. Several people even took notes. Ryan noticed it too. "Interesting," he remarked casually. Zoe glanced over. "What's interesting?" "Your husband." "What about him? He knows more than I expected." "He's smart," Ryan smiled. "Most quiet people are." Dinner continued. Salad, steak, dessert. Then came speeches. Glass River Realty's president thanked employees. California investors discussed future partnerships. Finally, Ryan approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," the ballroom became silent. "I'd like to recognize several individuals whose work has contributed to Colorado's remarkable growth." Names appeared one by one on a large projection screen. Senior brokers, development managers, investment analysts. Applause followed each introduction. Then Ryan smiled toward Zoe. "And finally," he gestured warmly, "someone whose professionalism represents exactly what this company stands for." Zoe straightened in her chair. "Our senior residential sales director." Applause erupted. "Zoe Walker." She walked confidently toward the stage. Ryan handed her a crystal award. Photographers captured the moment. Flash after flash illuminated the ballroom. Jacob applauded politely with everyone else. Margaret observed him quietly. His expression never changed. No resentment, no jealousy, only genuine appreciation. Zoe thanked the audience. She spoke confidently. "This recognition belongs to everyone I've worked beside." The audience applauded again. Returning to her table, she appeared energized. Recognition mattered deeply to her. Ryan leaned closer. "You earned it." "Thank you." "I meant every word." Across the room, dessert plates disappeared. Guests gradually returned to conversation. Margaret looked toward Jacob. You seem proud. I am. Even now, Jacob understood the question. Recognition should be celebrated, even if it's temporary. He looked toward the city lights beyond the glass windows. Everything is temporary. Margaret smiled faintly. That's probably why success never changed you. Jacob answered quietly. I've seen bridges that looked permanent. They weren't. They collapsed because everyone assumed they would last forever. Margaret looked thoughtfully towards the skyline. Outside, hundreds of lights stretched across Denver. Some represented old businesses. Others represented new fortunes still being built. Near the end of the evening, guests gathered near the ballroom exit. Ryan approached Jacob again. So, yeah, you should be proud of Zoe. I am. She's going places. Jacob smiled. I know. Ryan placed one hand casually into his pocket. Success changes people. Sometimes. You ever worry she'll outgrow you? The question sounded casual, almost playful. Several nearby executives chuckled softly. Zoe didn't interrupt. Jacob looked directly at Ryan. His answer arrived calmly. If someone outgrows honesty, he paused, they were never growing in the right direction. The small circle became unexpectedly quiet. Ryan laughed first. Fair enough. The tension disappeared, at least on the surface. As guests entered the elevators, Margaret remained standing near the ballroom entrance. She waited until Jacob walked past. Then she spoke softly enough that only he could hear. The acquisition closing date was finalized this afternoon. Jacob slowed. When? 3 weeks. She handed him a sealed envelope. Keep this private. He accepted it without opening it. Thank you. Margaret looked toward the elevators where Zoe and Ryan stood talking comfortably while waiting with the other executives. Then she turned back toward Jacob. 3 weeks can change an entire life. Jacob slipped the envelope into his messenger bag. He looked once toward Zoe. She was laughing. She hadn't noticed. She hadn't asked. She hadn't wondered why one of Denver's most respected corporate attorneys had quietly handed her husband confidential documents in the middle of the evening. Jacob entered the elevator carrying nothing more noticeable than an old leather bag. Inside it rested papers that would soon determine every decision he made next. The envelope remained unopened until nearly midnight. Jacob waited until Zoe had fallen asleep. The bedroom was dark, except for the soft amber glow from a reading lamp near his side of the bed. Rain tapped gently against the bedroom windows. He carried the envelope downstairs without making a sound. The kitchen felt strangely peaceful. The refrigerator hummed quietly. The old wall clock marked each passing second. Jacob poured himself a glass of water before sitting at the dining table. Only then did he break the seal. Inside rested several documents. The first confirmed the acquisition schedule, closing date, escrow timeline, projected wire transfer, tax estimates, everything Margaret had discussed. The second document surprised him even more. A handwritten note rested on top. Jacob, one final reminder. Once funds are released, privacy becomes your greatest asset. People will begin treating you differently if they learn the truth. Decide carefully who deserves to know. Margaret Jacob folded the note slowly. His eyes remained on the final sentence. Decide carefully who deserves to know. The words lingered longer than the financial numbers, because deep inside, another question had quietly begun forming. Who already believed they knew exactly who he was? He placed every page back into the envelope. Nothing about his routine changed the next morning. He still woke before sunrise, still brewed inexpensive coffee, still packed leftovers into the same lunch container, still drove the same Ford Escape toward work. The habits had never existed because he lacked money. They existed because discipline required repetition. At the engineering office, another bridge inspection occupied most of Saturday. Several younger engineers complained about working weekends. Jacob never did. He understood infrastructure didn't care about calendars. Steel fatigued regardless of holidays. Concrete cracked without asking permission. Late that morning, Tyler climbed onto the inspection platform beside him. "You hear about Henderson?" Jacob looked up. "What happened?" "He quit." "The structural designer?" "Yeah." "Found another company?" Tyler shrugged. "They offered almost 40 grand more." Jacob tightened a measurement clamp around a support beam. "Good for him." Tyler looked surprised. "You don't think he's crazy?" "No." "You've been here almost 15 years. 13. Never thought about leaving." Jacob looked across the river below. "I've thought about it." "So why stay?" "Sometimes finishing something matters more than starting something." Tyler laughed. "You always answer like that." Jacob smiled. "I know." By early afternoon, the inspection ended. Instead of driving home immediately, Jacob made another stop. Not at Bennett and Harlow. Not downtown. He drove 25 miles west toward Golden. A quiet residential neighborhood overlooked the foothills. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained sidewalks, children riding bicycles beneath mature maple trees. Jacob parked outside a recently completed subdivision. Silver Creek Estates. A discreet real estate sign stood beside the entrance. Luxury custom homes. Starting from $2.40. Million. Jacob remained inside his vehicle for several moments. He wasn't there by accident. 6 months earlier, he had privately visited the neighborhood with Margaret's recommendation. Not to purchase immediately. Simply to observe. To learn. To avoid emotional decisions. He parked near the sales office. A familiar woman greeted him before he even entered. "Mr. Walker." "Good afternoon, Allison." Allison Pierce had represented luxury home buyers for nearly 20 years. She had never once treated Jacob differently because of his clothing or vehicle. Professionalism meant consistency. "I'm glad you stopped by." "I had a little time." She smiled. "I have something you should see." Instead of entering the showroom, she guided him toward a completed home near the end of the street. The property overlooked open space and distant mountain ridges. Stone exterior, dark cedar accents, expansive windows. Nothing flashy. Everything intentional. Jacob admired the structural details before noticing anything decorative. Roof angles, drainage grading, retaining walls. Engineering first, beauty second. Allison unlocked the front door. The owners decided to relocate before closing. Jacob stepped inside. Natural light filled nearly every room. White oak flooring, high ceilings. A quiet simplicity that reminded him more of peace than wealth. No oversized chandeliers, no marble statues, no unnecessary extravagance, just thoughtful design. This feels... He searched briefly for the word. Comfortable. Allison smiled. That's exactly what the architect wanted. They walked slowly through the house. Kitchen, library, workshop, guest rooms. Then the primary bedroom overlooking the mountains. Jacob stood silently near the window. The landscape stretched for miles. Nothing blocked the view. He imagined drinking coffee there on quiet mornings, reading engineering journals, watching snowfall across the foothills. No noise, no constant pressure. Just stillness. Allison finally spoke. "I held this property." Jacob turned. "For me. I had a feeling you'd eventually come back. I wasn't sure. You are now." Jacob looked once more across the valley. "I think I am." She handed him updated pricing information. Because of market appreciation, the house now cost significantly more than 6 months earlier. Most buyers would have hesitated. Jacob simply nodded. "I'll let you know after closing." "I expected that answer." She smiled. "I'll continue holding it as long as I reasonably can." He thanked her before leaving. As Jacob drove away, another vehicle entered Silver Creek Estates. A black luxury SUV. Ryan Caldwell occupied the driver's seat. The subdivision had become popular among Denver executives. He slowed briefly beside the same model home. Construction managers greeted him warmly. Jacob noticed none of it. Their paths crossed without either man realizing it, one quietly preparing for a future, the other assuming the future already belonged to him. Sunday afternoon brought another family gathering. Zoe insisted they attend her parents' barbecue in Littleton. Jacob agreed without argument. The backyard filled with relatives. Children chased one another across the lawn. Neighbors wandered between patio tables carrying paper plates stacked with hamburgers and grilled vegetables. Zoe's older sister, Melissa Carter, embraced her immediately. "You look amazing." "So do you." Melissa then greeted Jacob politely. "Hi. Good to see you." Her husband Eric approached carrying 2 drinks. "Jacob?" "Eric." Eric worked as a commercial airline pilot, confident but respectful. Unlike several others in Zoe's family, he had always appreciated Jacob's calm nature. The afternoon unfolded comfortably until conversation drifted toward careers. Melissa proudly announced another promotion. Eric discussed new international routes. Someone asked Zoe about Glass River Realty. She described company growth enthusiastically. Then Zoe's mother smiled toward Jacob. "And how's engineering?" Jacob answered honestly. "Busy." Her father laughed. "Still building bridges." "Among other things." Melissa smiled politely. "I don't know how you stay in one career so long." Jacob shrugged. "I enjoy it." Zoe reached for another drink. "He never wants anything different." The words sounded light, almost joking. Several relatives laughed. Jacob smiled politely. Her father added another comment. "Some people are just comfortable." Zoe nodded. "Exactly." Eric looked toward Jacob. "You've always struck me as someone playing the long game." Jacob met his eyes. "I try." Eric smiled. "Nothing wrong with that." The conversation moved elsewhere. Jacob noticed Eric had quietly changed the subject. Not everyone joined the subtle criticisms. Some simply watched. After dinner, Jacob wandered toward the backyard fence. The Rocky Mountains stood faintly against the western horizon. Eric joined him. "You okay?" "I'm fine." Eric folded his arms. "You've been married how long now?" 11 years. "You still love her?" Jacob answered without hesitation. "Yes." Eric looked thoughtfully towards the mountains. "Does she know?" Jacob didn't answer immediately. "I don't know." Eric nodded slowly. "I've flown enough storms to know something." "What?" "The worst turbulence isn't outside the airplane." Jacob smiled slightly. "No. It's inside the cockpit when the crew stops trusting each other." The comparison lingered. Neither man spoke for almost a minute. Finally, Eric asked another question. "You ever think about starting over?" Jacob watched the evening sun disappear behind distant peaks. "I've thought about preparing." "For what?" he answered quietly. "So that if life forces me to start over," he looked down briefly at his wedding ring, "I'll already know where I'm going." Eric studied him carefully. There was something different in Jacob's voice. Not anger, not sadness, certainty. The kind that came only after months of silent decisions. As the barbecue ended, Zoe climbed into her own vehicle. She planned to meet several co-workers for evening drinks. "You coming?" Jacob shook his head. "I've got an early inspection tomorrow." She seemed unsurprised. "Suit yourself." She drove away without another word. Jacob watched the taillights disappear down the quiet suburban street. Then he climbed into his old Ford. Before starting the engine, his phone vibrated. A new email. From Allison Pierce. Subject: property reservation extension. Confirmed. Jacob opened it. The final sentence read simply, "The home will remain exclusively reserved for you until the acquisition closes." Jacob stared at the message. Then he looked through the windshield toward the fading mountains. He finally allowed himself the smallest smile, because for the first time, the future no longer existed only inside his imagination. It was waiting, with his name already attached to the front door. Monday morning began with an unexpected invitation. Jacob had barely finished reviewing the week's inspection schedule when his office phone rang. "Jacob Walker." "Morning." He recognized the voice immediately. Margaret Bennett. "Good morning. Can you meet me for lunch?" He glanced toward the engineering calendar. "I have an opening at noon. Union Station. 12:15. Perfect." The call lasted less than 30 seconds. No explanation. No unnecessary words. Margaret never discussed confidential matters over the phone. Jacob appreciated that. The morning passed quickly. His team inspected retaining walls along Interstate 70 before returning downtown. Tyler noticed Jacob checking his watch. "You've got somewhere to be?" "Lunch meeting." "Client?" "Something like that." Tyler laughed. "You actually have a life outside engineering." Jacob smiled. "Occasionally." At precisely 12:12 p.m., Jacob entered Union Station. The historic building bustled with travelers, business professionals, and tourists carrying rolling suitcases across polished stone floors. Margaret already occupied a quiet corner table inside a small cafe. She ordered black coffee. Jacob chose grilled chicken and iced tea. Neither mentioned business until the waitress left. Margaret reached into her leather portfolio. "I have good news." She slid another folder across the table. "The due diligence review concluded yesterday." Jacob opened it carefully. Every page carried legal certifications, asset verification, ownership confirmation, transfer approvals. Nothing remained uncertain. "The acquisition is now irreversible." Jacob looked up. "So it's done?" "Legally, yes. Financial closing remains." "Correct." She folded her hands. "There is one more matter." Jacob waited. "The previous ownership group requested complete anonymity." "I expected that." "They also requested no press coverage." "Even better." Margaret smiled faintly. "You've never wanted attention." "I've seen what attention does." She nodded. "It changes conversations." Jacob knew she wasn't talking only about business. Margaret continued. "I've also prepared something else." She produced another document. "This is a personal asset protection plan." Jacob scanned several pages. Separate banking arrangements, privacy trusts, residential ownership structures, everything designed to protect identity. "You've thought of everything." "I've represented lottery winners." Jacob looked curious. "They usually lose more than money." "Because people change?" "No," Margaret answered carefully. "They discover people had already changed." Those words remained with Jacob long after lunch ended. As he walked back toward his office, he replayed the sentence repeatedly. People had already changed. Money merely revealed it. That afternoon, another surprise waited. An email from Human Resources announced company restructuring. Mandatory staff meeting. 3 o'clock. Entire engineering division. Employees gathered inside the conference room. Department Manager Alan Foster stood beside a projection screen. His expression looked unusually serious. "I'll keep this brief." Several employees exchanged nervous glances. "Our Denver transportation contract has been reduced." Silence settled across the room. "As a result," Alan hesitated, "the company will eliminate several senior positions over the next 60 days. Whispers immediately spread. Tyler leaned toward Jacob. "This can't be good." Jacob remained quiet. Alan continued. "No decisions have been finalized. But voluntary retirement packages will be offered first?" Slides displayed projected staffing reductions, budget forecasts, revenue declines. Several engineers appeared visibly anxious. One younger employee quietly asked, "What happens if not enough people volunteer?" Alan answered honestly. "Then layoffs." The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Groups immediately formed throughout the office. Everyone speculated. Everyone worried. Except Jacob. Tyler noticed. "You're awfully calm." Jacob placed several drawings into his briefcase. "Worry doesn't change numbers." "Aren't you concerned?" "I've learned to prepare before I panic." Tyler laughed weakly. "I wish I could think like that." Jacob smiled. "So do most investors." He didn't realize how accurate that statement actually was. Later that evening, Jacob arrived home earlier than usual. Zoe stood inside the kitchen speaking excitedly on speakerphone. "No, seriously," she laughed. "It could actually happen." Jacob quietly placed his keys on the counter. She noticed him. "I'll call you back." The conversation ended. Jacob poured himself water. "Good day?" She looked almost energized. "You'll never believe it." "What?" "Ryan wants to expand." "Glass River?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Arizona." "That's impressive." "He wants me involved." Jacob looked toward her. "In what role?" "They haven't finalized titles." She smiled proudly. "But regional leadership." "When?" "Maybe next year." Jacob congratulated her sincerely. "I'm happy for you." She searched his face. "You really are." "I said I was." She seemed almost disappointed by his lack of visible excitement. "I thought you'd have more questions. I trust you'll tell me what matters." She folded her arms. "Sometimes I think you're impossible to read." Jacob smiled gently. "Maybe." She looked toward his old messenger bag. "What was your lunch meeting?" "An attorney." "For what?" "Personal business." "What kind?" "Planning." She frowned slightly. "What planning?" Jacob answered truthfully. "The future." She laughed. "What future?" "Our future." She smiled dismissively. "You've become mysterious lately." "I've become organized." She shook her head before walking upstairs. The conversation ended there. Not because Jacob hid the truth. Because Zoe had already decided his answer couldn't possibly be interesting. Tuesday evening brought another company function. This one less formal. A networking reception hosted by the Denver Commercial Development Council. Zoe insisted Jacob attend. "It'll be good for connections." Jacob agreed. The event occupied a renovated warehouse converted into a modern event venue. Craft cocktails, local investors, architects, developers, commercial lenders, construction executives. Jacob knew many of them professionally. Few realized it. A structural engineer often remained invisible once buildings stood successfully. People remembered architects, not calculations. Ryan greeted them near the entrance. "Glad you made it." Zoe smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." Ryan looked toward Jacob. "Drinks?" "I'm good." Ryan accepted another whiskey before leading Zoe toward several investors. Jacob wandered naturally through smaller conversations. One architect recognized him. "Jacob Walker." "Yes." "You reviewed the South Platte pedestrian bridge." "I did." The architect extended his hand. "Your redesign saved us nearly $6 million. Jacob smiled politely. "The contractors deserve credit too." "No." The architect laughed. "That was your foundation model." Nearby developers overheard the conversation. One joined them. "Were you involved in the Platte project?" Jacob nodded. "Part of the engineering team." Another executive added, "That's one of the safest bridge designs in Colorado." Jacob shrugged modestly. "It met specifications." Word spread surprisingly fast. Within minutes, several engineers and developers surrounded him, asking technical questions. load tolerances, expansion joints, flood resilience, Jacob answered patiently. Across the room, Zoe noticed. Ryan noticed too. Your husband's popular tonight? Zoe looked genuinely surprised. I've never seen that before. Ryan watched Jacob explaining bridge design to 3 commercial developers. They're listening. I know. You didn't tell me he worked on Platt. I didn't know. Ryan turned toward her. You didn't know? She hesitated. He doesn't really talk about work. Ryan looked thoughtful. Maybe he should. Several minutes later, Jacob excused himself for fresh air. The rooftop terrace overlooked downtown Denver. Night lights shimmered across glass buildings. Someone stepped beside him, an older man wearing a navy overcoat. I hoped I'd find you. Jacob recognized him immediately. Charles Whitaker, one of the original founders involved in the acquisition Margaret had managed. The man extended his hand warmly. I wanted to thank you personally. Jacob accepted the handshake. You really don't have to. I do. Charles looked toward the skyline. I spent 40 years building that company. I know. I interviewed dozens of buyers. Jacob remained silent. They all wanted the assets. Charles looked directly at him. You were the only one who wanted the people. Jacob answered quietly. They built the company. Charles smiled. Exactly. He reached into his coat pocket. I won't keep you. He handed Jacob an old brass key. Jacob looked confused. The original office. Charles smiled. I thought its next owner should have it. Jacob carefully accepted the key. It felt unexpectedly heavy. Not because of metal, because of responsibility. Charles placed one hand on Jacob's shoulder. 3 weeks. I know. Protect what we've built. I will. Neither man noticed someone standing inside the rooftop doorway. Ryan. He hadn't heard the conversation. Only seen an elderly businessman hand Jacob an old key with remarkable respect before shaking his hand like an equal. Ryan frowned. For the first time, he found himself wondering whether the quiet engineer everyone overlooked might not be as ordinary as he had always assumed. Ryan Caldwell could not explain why the image refused to leave his mind. It was not the old brass key. It was not the elderly gentleman. It was the handshake, equal, respectful, unforced. Ryan had spent nearly 20 years negotiating with investors, developers, and executives. He knew the difference between polite courtesy and genuine respect. Whatever he had witnessed on the rooftop had belonged to the second category. The following morning, he arrived at Glass River Realty earlier than usual. Zoe entered carrying 2 coffees. You beat everyone here. Ryan barely looked up from his computer. Couldn't sleep. She set 1 cup beside him. Everything okay? I wanted to ask you something. Sure. Ryan leaned back. Your husband. Zoe smiled faintly. What about him? What exactly does he do? She laughed. I've told you. He's a structural engineer. I know that. Ryan folded his arms. I mean, what kind? What do you mean? He seemed to know half the commercial developers last night. Zoe shrugged. I guess he works on public projects. You guess? She looked slightly embarrassed. He doesn't really bring work home. Ryan watched her carefully. You've never asked? I've asked. And? He just says bridges inspections infrastructure. Ryan nodded slowly. Then he changed the subject. But curiosity had already taken root. Meanwhile, Jacob spent the morning walking through Falcon Ridge Capital's headquarters for the first time since the acquisition became legally irreversible. The building occupied 4 quiet floors inside a renovated brick structure near Denver's lower downtown district. Nothing about the exterior suggested extraordinary wealth. No oversized company logo, no elaborate lobby, no luxury displays, only clean architecture, intentional privacy. Charles Whitaker greeted him near the entrance. "I thought you should see everything before closing." Jacob appreciated the gesture. Employees continued working normally. Very few realized ownership had already changed on paper. Charles guided him room by room. Investment research, risk analysis, private client services, legal compliance, operations. Every department appeared remarkably calm. Nobody rushed, nobody performed for appearances. The company operated with disciplined efficiency. Jacob noticed small details: whiteboards filled with handwritten strategy, employees eating lunch together instead of behind closed office doors, managers speaking quietly with interns, no executive offices larger than necessary. Charles smiled. "I built it this way." "I can see that. We never wanted people chasing titles." Jacob looked toward a young analyst explaining financial models to an assistant. "They seem comfortable asking questions." "That was always the goal." They eventually reached the executive floor. Charles unlocked a modest corner office. "This becomes yours." Jacob entered slowly. The office overlooked downtown Denver. Floor-to-ceiling windows, simple walnut desk, bookshelves, no extravagant decorations. Charles noticed Jacob studying the room. Disappointed, Jacob smiled. "No. I expected bigger. I specifically requested smaller." Charles laughed. "I knew we'd get along." He walked toward the desk. "My father taught me something." "What?" "If your office is larger than your employee's ambition," he paused, "you're sitting in the wrong room." Jacob quietly nodded. Another lesson worth remembering. Charles opened a drawer. Inside rested several framed photographs: company founders, early employees, construction of the first office, picnics, volunteer projects, Christmas gatherings. Jacob noticed every photograph included staff members, none focused exclusively on executives. Charles said softly, "We never forgot who actually created value." Jacob answered, "I won't either." Charles believed him, for reasons he couldn't fully explain. That afternoon, Jacob met several senior managers individually. No announcements, no speeches, only conversations. He asked each person the same question. "What prevents you from doing your best work?" The answers varied. Outdated software, hiring delays, regulatory paperwork, training limitations. Nobody complained about salaries first. Jacob listened far more than he spoke. By 4 o'clock, he carried nearly 3 pages of handwritten notes. Not instructions, observations. Margaret Bennett entered quietly. "How's your first unofficial day?" Jacob smiled. "I've learned more by asking one question than reading 50 reports." Margaret glanced toward the notebook. "That's why Charles chose you." Jacob looked toward the operations floor below. "I haven't earned anything yet." "You earned his trust." "Now I have to deserve it." Margaret smiled. "Exactly." Across town, Zoe's day unfolded very differently. Ryan called an unexpected executive meeting. Regional expansion, new organizational structure, higher expectations. Pressure filled the conference room. Ryan paced before a digital presentation. "We're entering a different market." Everyone watched silently. "I need people willing to commit completely." His eyes briefly settled on Zoe. She interpreted it as encouragement. After the meeting, co-worker Danielle Foster caught up with her. "I think you're getting promoted." Zoe smiled. "I hope so." "You practically run half the office already." Zoe laughed. "Not quite." Danielle lowered her voice. "What about your husband?" "What about him?" "If you relocate—" Zoe hesitated. "I haven't thought that far." Danielle looked surprised. "You'd move alone." "I don't know." "You think he'd leave Colorado?" Zoe answered automatically. "He'll follow wherever I go." The certainty in her voice surprised even herself. That evening, Jacob returned home carrying grocery bags. He cooked dinner before Zoe arrived. Roasted salmon, rice, asparagus. Simple, healthy. By the time she entered the house, everything waited on the table. "You cooked," Jacob smiled. "You've had long days." She removed her coat. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." During dinner, she spoke almost non-stop about Arizona, potential offices, corporate housing, leadership opportunities, Ryan's confidence. Jacob listened patiently. Only once did he interrupt. "Have they officially offered the position?" "No. But Ryan practically confirmed it." Jacob nodded. "I hope it works out." She frowned slightly. "That's all? What else would you like me to say?" "I don't know." She searched his face. "Something." Jacob placed his fork down carefully. "I'm proud that you've worked hard." She waited. "I also think important decisions deserve complete information." "What does that mean?" "It means waiting until an offer becomes real." She sighed. "You always wait." "I prepare." "Same difference." Jacob didn't argue, because they were not the same thing, not even close. After dinner, Zoe disappeared upstairs to join another video call with coworkers. Jacob remained downstairs. His laptop rested unopened on the dining table. Instead, he retrieved a legal folder. The property reservation agreement. He reviewed every page carefully, not because he doubted Margaret, because preparation meant understanding every signature before making it. His phone buzzed. A text from Allison Pierce. "Thought you'd like to know? Someone made a cash offer on the house today." Jacob's eyes narrowed. The next message appeared. "I declined, as promised." He immediately called her. "Jacob." "Thank you." "They offered over asking." "I appreciate your integrity." "I gave them another property." Jacob remained silent for a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "I keep my word." He smiled. "I'll do everything possible to close on schedule." "I know you will." Before ending the call, Allison added quietly, "One more thing." "Yes." "The couple who wanted your house?" She hesitated. "Works in commercial real estate." Jacob felt something tighten inside his thoughts. Did they mention names? No. But the husband said his company was expanding into Arizona. Silence settled between them. Jacob immediately thought of Ryan. Arizona, commercial real estate, executive salary. It could have been coincidence. Colorado contained many developers. Yet something about the timing felt unusually precise. He thanked Allison and ended the call. Jacob did not jump to conclusions. He never had. Instead, he opened his notebook. He wrote only 3 words. Verify before believing. Then he closed the notebook. Upstairs, Zoe laughed during another video conference. Downstairs, Jacob quietly reviewed public property records available through the county database, not searching for evidence, only information. Ownership filings, development permits, corporate registrations, routine documents, preparation, nothing more. 30 minutes later, he closed the laptop. He had found nothing unusual, which satisfied him, because assumptions had destroyed more lives than facts ever had. The next morning, Jacob arrived at work before sunrise. An unfamiliar black luxury sedan waited outside the engineering office. A sharply dressed man stepped from the vehicle. He approached Jacob directly. "Mr. Walker?" "Yes." The man handed him an embossed envelope. "No signature required?" Jacob accepted it. "Who sent this?" "The sender requested privacy." The sedan disappeared before Jacob could ask another question. Standing alone in the cool morning air, Jacob opened the envelope. Inside rested a single cream-colored card. Only one sentence had been typed across the center. "Someone knows what you're about to become. Jacob stared at the words. There was no signature, no return address, nothing else. Only that single sentence. For the first time since this journey had begun, someone else had entered the game. Jacob read the anonymous note 3 more times before folding it neatly back into the envelope. Someone knows what you're about to become. The wording interested him more than the warning itself. Not who you are, not what you've done, what you're about to become. Whoever had written the message knew enough to understand that the acquisition had not yet become public. That immediately narrowed the possibilities. Charles, Margaret, the legal team, the financial institution handling the closing, or someone watching one of them. Jacob placed the envelope inside his briefcase instead of throwing it away. Evidence deserved preservation. Speculation deserved restraint. He spent the morning inspecting an elevated highway rehabilitation project west of Denver. Concrete cores, expansion joints, load calculations. The work demanded complete concentration, Tyler eventually noticed. "You've been quieter than usual." Jacob smiled faintly. I'm working." "No." Tyler shook his head. "You're thinking." "They're a difference." "Usually." Jacob laughed. "You're getting observant. I've learned from you." Tyler hesitated. "Everything okay?" Jacob answered honestly. "I received an interesting letter." "What kind?" "Anonymous." Tyler immediately frowned. "Threat?" "I don't know." "You report it?" "Not yet." Tyler looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because I don't know whether it's a threat, a joke, or information." Tyler scratched his head. "You always wait for facts." "They usually arrive." That afternoon, Jacob stopped by Margaret Bennett's office without an appointment. Her assistant recognized him immediately. "Mr. Walker?" "Is Margaret available?" "I'll check." Less than a minute later, he entered her office. She noticed the envelope in his hand. Something happened. Jacob placed it on her desk. "I received this." She carefully read the single sentence. Her expression remained controlled. "When? This morning." "Delivered how?" "Hand-delivered." "By whom? A courier?" "No name." Jacob shook his head. Margaret leaned back. "This wasn't random." "I agree. Did anyone follow you?" "Not that I noticed." She considered the wording. "This doesn't sound like blackmail." "No. It sounds like observation." Jacob nodded. "Exactly." Margaret opened a secure cabinet and removed another folder. "Our confidentiality list. Inside were every individual with legal knowledge of the acquisition. 31 names, lawyers, auditors, bank executives, regulators. Charles, Margaret, Jacob. No one else." "Could there have been a leak?" Margaret answered carefully. "Every transaction leaks eventually. But before closing." "Rare." She circled 3 names. "These individuals had access outside our office." Jacob looked at them. Investment banker, escrow administrator, document courier service. Margaret looked directly at him. "I'm launching an internal review. I don't want anyone accused without evidence." "I know." She smiled slightly. "That's exactly why Charles chose you." Jacob left feeling calmer than when he had arrived. Someone might know, but they still didn't know enough. If they had, the note would have contained names, not predictions. Across the city, Ryan Caldwell received different news. His assistant entered carrying a folder. "Good timing." Ryan looked up. "What is it?" "Property market update." He skimmed several pages. Commercial acquisitions, investment groups, corporate relocations. One article caught his attention. Private capital firm expands quietly across Colorado. No company name, no ownership disclosed, only anonymous references to a confidential acquisition scheduled to close within weeks. Ryan frowned. "Who wrote this?" "Denver Business Ledger." "Any details?" "Almost none." He reread the article. It mentioned only one thing with certainty. The new owner had insisted on absolute privacy. Ryan leaned back thoughtfully. Privacy. The word reminded him of Jacob, his mysterious lunch meetings, the rooftop conversation, the brass key. No, impossible. He almost laughed at himself. Jacob was an engineer, not an investor. Still, something refused to settle. That evening, Ryan attended another networking dinner hosted by commercial developers. One guest happened to mention Falcon Ridge Capital. They're changing ownership. Ryan looked interested. You know who's buying? The investor shook his head. Nobody does. Large company. Private buyer. Local? No clue. Another developer joined the conversation. I heard the buyer refused publicity. Ryan smiled. Odd. The older developer shrugged. Usually means old money. Ryan stored the comment away. Old money. Quiet money. Invisible money. Meanwhile, Jacob drove 45 minutes outside Denver to meet Allison Pierce at the nearly completed house. She unlocked the front door. I thought you'd want to see the progress. Sunlight poured through oversized windows. Fresh hardwood flooring reflected warm afternoon light. Kitchen cabinets had been installed, stone countertops, fireplace. Everything looked exactly as the architectural renderings had promised. Jacob slowly walked from room to room, not admiring luxury, imagining peace. The master bedroom overlooked pine-covered hills. A quiet walking trail disappeared into the trees behind the property. No traffic, no crowds, no constant noise. Allison watched him. You like quiet? I do. She smiled. I guessed correctly. Jacob stopped near the living room windows. My father always said, he paused, if your home doesn't lower your heartbeat, it's just another building. Allison smiled. Smart man. He was. She handed him another folder. Inspection reports. Jacob reviewed them. Everything remained on schedule, closing in just under 3 weeks. One concern. Allison pointed toward the neighboring property. The owner next door wants to meet whoever buys this place. Jacob looked curious. Friendly. I think so. What's his name? Frank Donovan. What does he do? Retired firefighter. Jacob smiled. I'll introduce myself after closing. Allison laughed. Most buyers ask whether the neighbors are difficult. Jacob closed the folder. People matter more than fences. As he prepared to leave, Allison remembered something. Oh. She reached into a drawer. This came yesterday. She handed him a small package addressed simply to resident. No return address. Jacob frowned. Another anonymous delivery. Inside rested a simple fountain pen. Expensive, heavy, engraved. Only 3 words appeared beneath the clip. Sign wisely, Jacob. He looked up immediately. Allison saw his expression. You know who sent it? No. This isn't funny. No. It isn't. Back home, Jacob placed both anonymous items on his desk. The envelope, the pen. Neither contained threats. Neither demanded money. Both implied knowledge. Someone watched. But why remain hidden? His phone rang. Charles Whitaker. I was about to call you. Charles sounded unusually serious. I need to ask something. Go ahead. Have you received anything unusual? Jacob looked toward the desk. Yes. Silence. So have I. Jacob straightened. What happened? Flowers? Jacob waited. No card. No message. Only one white orchid. Jacob frowned. What does that mean? I don't know. Charles continued quietly. But my late wife always sent white orchids after difficult victories. Jacob understood. Someone knows your history. Exactly. Charles lowered his voice. We're being studied, Jacob answered calmly. Not attacked. Yet. No, Charles agreed. Not yet. They decided to meet the following morning with Margaret. No assumptions, only comparison, only evidence. After ending the call, Jacob opened his notebook once more. He added another line beneath the previous entry. Patterns reveal people. He stared at both sentences. Verify before believing. Patterns reveal people. Outside rain began tapping softly against the windows. Upstairs, Zoe was packing a suitcase, not for Arizona, for a 3-day corporate retreat in Aspen. She came downstairs carrying folded business clothes. Ryan invited the executive candidates. Jacob smiled. Congratulations. I leave tomorrow morning. I'll drive you. You don't have to. I know. She looked at him for a long moment. You're always steady. I try. She hesitated. Doesn't anything ever shake you? Jacob looked toward the rain beyond the window. It does? What? He answered quietly, losing perspective. She didn't understand the answer. She simply nodded before returning upstairs. Jacob watched her disappear. He wished she had asked one more question. Not about Arizona, not about promotions. Only one simple question. How was your day? She never did. Late that night, after Zoe had fallen asleep, Jacob received one final message. This one arrived by email. No sender name, no signature. Attached was a single photograph. It showed him standing beside Charles Whitaker on the rooftop 3 nights earlier. The picture had been taken from a distant building with a powerful telephoto lens. At the bottom appeared another sentence. You're not the only one planning ahead. Jacob slowly enlarged the photograph. His eyes stopped on one small detail reflected in the rooftop glass behind Charles. A faint silhouette. Not the photographer. Someone else. Someone standing much closer than anyone had realized. Someone who had been inside the meeting all along. Jacob arrived at Margaret Bennett's office precisely at 7:30 the following morning. Charles Whitaker was already there. The retired founder stood beside the conference room window, holding a cup of black coffee without drinking it. He turned as Jacob entered. You brought yours? Jacob placed the anonymous envelope, the engraved fountain pen, and the printed photograph on the polished walnut table. Charles quietly placed a white orchid inside a protective evidence sleeve. Margaret entered carrying a legal pad. She closed the conference room door herself. No assistance. No interruptions. No assumptions. Jacob appreciated the order. She began by arranging every anonymous item in chronological sequence. The envelope. The pen. The flower. The photograph. She looked at both men. What do they have in common? Charles answered first. No demands. Jacob added. No threats. Margaret nodded. Exactly. She circled 4 words on her notebook. Observation, patience, knowledge, restraint. This isn't harassment. Charles frowned. You sound certain. I am. Margaret tapped the photograph. Whoever is behind this wants you to know they're watching. Why? They're creating psychological pressure. Jacob studied the enlarged rooftop image once more. The mysterious silhouette reflected in the glass remained faint, almost invisible. Margaret pushed another photograph toward him. I enhanced the reflection overnight. Jacob leaned forward. The figure had become clearer, still blurred. But one detail stood out immediately. A security badge clipped to a jacket. Charles narrowed his eyes. Our rooftop security staff never wore jackets. Margaret nodded. I checked. So, that badge isn't Falcon Ridge. Jacob remained silent. Margaret continued. It's from another building. She slid a downtown map across the table. The rooftop overlooked 6 neighboring office towers. Only one possessed a direct line of sight matching the photograph's angle. The Harrison Financial Center. Charles recognized the building immediately. Who rents there? Margaret answered. Mostly law firms. She paused. And commercial real estate companies. Jacob slowly looked up. Ryan Caldwell's company occupied 3 floors inside Harrison Financial Center. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Charles broke the silence. Coincidence, Jacob answered before Margaret could. Probably. Margaret smiled slightly. I appreciate that answer. Jacob folded the photograph. We still don't have evidence connecting Ryan. We have geography. That's not enough. Margaret nodded approvingly. Good. She stood. So we investigate geography. Nothing else. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, Zoe arrived at Aspen Ridge Lodge for Glass River Realty's executive retreat. Luxury SUVs lined the entrance, regional directors, vice presidents, senior managers. Ryan welcomed every arriving executive personally. When Zoe stepped from her car, he smiled warmly. You made it. I wouldn't miss this. He handed her a room key. We've got strategy sessions all morning. She noticed the room assignments. Every executive candidate occupied the same floor. Competitive. Intentional. During breakfast, Ryan introduced each department leader. Expansion plans, market forecasts, Arizona relocation timelines. The atmosphere buzzed with ambition. Zoe felt energized. For the first time in years, she believed she could finally leave ordinary life behind. Back in Denver, Jacob and Margaret visited Harrison Financial Center, not to accuse, to observe. The lobby remained busy with professionals carrying briefcases and coffee. Margaret quietly approached the front desk. I'm looking for building management. The receptionist smiled politely. 4th floor. Within 20 minutes, Margaret emerged from the property management office carrying a visitor information packet. Jacob noticed. They cooperated. They like attorneys. What did you learn? The rooftop access logs. Jacob looked interested. They keep records. Every electronic badge. She stopped walking. The night you met Charles, she opened the folder. 3 visitors accessed the roof. Charles, Jacob, a building maintenance supervisor. Jacob frowned. Only 3? Officially. She pointed toward another section. But someone disabled 1 rooftop security camera for exactly 17 minutes. Charles looked surprised. Equipment failure. Margaret shook her head. It was manually disconnected. Jacob quietly absorbed the information. Not random, planned. Someone expected that meeting. Someone knew where to look. Tyler called just as Jacob returned to his truck. You need to hear something. What happened? A man came asking about you. Jacob's expression remained calm. What did he want? He claimed to represent an engineering recruiting firm. Name? He wouldn't give one. What did he ask? Tyler opened his notebook. I wrote everything down. Jacob smiled. Of course he did. He asked how long you've worked here. Okay. Whether you planned to relocate. Jacob remained silent. And whether anyone ever visited you at work. What did you tell him? Nothing. Jacob smiled again. Good. I figured you'd want facts. I always do. That afternoon, Jacob returned to Falcon Ridge Capital for another private transition meeting. Charles reviewed investment portfolios, pending acquisitions, long-term infrastructure projects. The conversation remained focused until Jacob mentioned the anonymous messages. Charles listened quietly, then surprised him. I've seen this before. Jacob looked up. When? 19 years ago. Margaret stopped writing. Charles continued slowly. A competitor wanted information before a merger. What happened? They never asked direct questions. They watched. They waited. They collected habits. Jacob understood. They wanted people to reveal themselves. Charles nodded. Exactly. The impatient employees exposed everything. The disciplined ones exposed nothing. Margaret leaned forward. So this may not be about money. Charles answered, It may be about character. Jacob considered that possibility carefully. Someone wasn't merely gathering information. Someone was measuring reactions. Would Jacob panic? Would he accuse? Would he hide? Would he become careless? He quietly smiled. They had chosen the wrong man. Late that afternoon, Zoe attended a private dinner for executive candidates. Ryan sat beside her. Conversation gradually shifted from business toward personal lives. One executive asked casually, Your husband coming if you move? Zoe smiled. He'll support whatever I decide. Ryan asked, What does he think? He says we'll decide together. Ryan chuckled. That's diplomatic. She laughed. That's Jacob. Another executive leaned across the table. What does he do again? Structural engineer. For who? Zoe hesitated. I'm actually not sure of the current client. Ryan noticed. You don't know. He doesn't really discuss work. The executive shrugged. My wife knows every project I'm handling. Zoe forced another smile. Jacob's different. Ryan changed the subject, but something lingered. For the first time, he wondered whether Zoe truly knew her husband at all. That evening, Jacob received another unexpected visitor. Frank Donovan, the retired firefighter from the neighboring property. Allison had apparently given him Jacob's temporary mailing address. Frank carried a homemade apple pie. My wife insisted. Jacob smiled warmly. You didn't have to. I know. Frank looked around the modest house. You buying the place next door? I am. Good. They sat on the porch for nearly an hour. Frank spoke about hiking trails, winter snow, volunteer fire departments, neighborhood traditions. Not once did he ask about Jacob's finances, or career, or plans. As Frank prepared to leave, he stopped. One thing. Jacob waited. You'll probably notice a black SUV now and then. Jacob immediately became attentive. Whose? No idea. It parks near the trail entrance. Never stays long. Just watches houses. Jacob asked calmly. How often? Twice this week. What time? Usually evening. Jacob thanked him. After Frank left, Jacob drove to the neighborhood entrance. He parked without attracting attention. 40 minutes passed. Nothing. Then headlights appeared. A black SUV rolled slowly along the street. It never exceeded 15 miles per hour. The driver wore sunglasses despite the fading daylight. The vehicle paused briefly near Jacob's future home, then continued toward the highway. Jacob memorized the license plate. He did not follow. Instead, he photographed it from a distance. Evidence, not confrontation. Back home, he entered the plate number into a licensed public vehicle database available through his engineering firm's investigative subscription. Registration returned within seconds. The SUV belonged to a vehicle leasing company, commercial fleet. No private owner listed. Another layer, another wall. His phone buzzed again. Margaret. I've got something. What? The courier. Jacob listened carefully. The man who delivered your envelope never worked for the courier company whose uniform he wore. Jacob remained completely still. So he was impersonating an employee? Yes. We found the real courier. He was on vacation. Silence filled the room. Margaret continued quietly. Jacob. Someone planned every detail. He looked toward the anonymous pen resting on his desk. The photograph, the orchid, the envelope, the SUV, the false courier. None of it was accidental. None of it was emotional. Whoever stood behind the operation possessed money, organization, discipline, patience, the exact same qualities Jacob respected most, which made the situation even more dangerous. Before ending the call, Margaret added one final sentence. We finally identified one fingerprint. Jacob's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Whose? It belongs to someone who officially died 11 years ago. The fingerprint report arrived at Margaret Bennett's office before 8 o'clock the next morning. She read it twice, then a third time. The laboratory had confirmed the print belonged to Ethan Cross, officially deceased, declared dead after a warehouse fire outside St. Louis 11 years earlier. Margaret immediately called Jacob. He answered on the second ring. "You've read it?" "I have." "What do you think?" Jacob remained quiet for several seconds. "I think either the fingerprint is wrong," he paused, "or the death certificate is." Margaret smiled slightly. "Exactly. Where are you?" "Leaving for your office." "I'll meet you downstairs." 30 minutes later, they sat inside a secure conference room at Falcon Ridge Capitol. Charles Whitaker listened carefully as Margaret summarized the forensic report. He frowned. Ethan Cross. The name clearly meant something to him. Jacob noticed immediately. "You know him?" Charles nodded slowly. "I knew him. He was one of the sharpest corporate investigators I've ever hired." Margaret looked surprised. "You employed him?" 19 years ago. "What happened?" Charles folded his hands. He specialized in uncovering corporate espionage. He recovered stolen patents, found fraudulent executives, exposed 2 acquisition leaks. Jacob leaned forward. Then, Charles's expression darkened. Then he disappeared. "The fire?" Charles nodded. "The authorities found remains. Dental records matched?" Margaret asked quietly, "Did you ever believe he was dead?" Charles took a long breath. "I believed the evidence. But I never believed Ethan would lose a fight that easily." Silence settled across the room. Margaret wrote another name into her notebook, Ethan Cross, alive unknown. Jacob stared at the fingerprint report. Someone had either stolen Ethan's identity, or Ethan had spent 11 years hiding. Neither explanation felt ordinary. Charles stood and walked toward the window. "If Ethan is alive," he stopped, "then someone hired the most patient investigator I've ever met." Jacob asked the obvious question. "Who could afford him?" Charles answered without turning around. "Very few people." Margaret added another note. "We follow the money." Jacob nodded. "Always?" The investigation shifted direction that morning. No longer searching for random stalkers. No longer chasing anonymous messages. Now they searched for financial connections reaching back more than a decade. Margaret requested sealed court records. Charles contacted retired federal investigators he still trusted. Jacob returned to work, because routine remained his greatest advantage. At Denver Structural Engineering, Tyler noticed nothing unusual except the growing stack of project folders on Jacob's desk. "You planning to retire?" Jacob smiled. "No." "Then why are you organizing everything?" "So anyone could replace me tomorrow." Tyler laughed. "Nobody could." "They could. You've got 20 years of experience." Jacob looked at him. "Experience belongs in systems, not people." Tyler considered that sentence. "You really believe that?" "I do." "If I disappear tomorrow," Jacob tapped the organized binders, "every bridge still gets built." Tyler smiled. "I hope you don't disappear." Jacob smiled back. "So do I." Later that afternoon, the engineering firm received an unexpected visitor, a woman in her late 60s, silver hair, navy blazer, walking cane. She asked specifically for Jacob Walker. Tyler escorted her into the conference room. Jacob entered moments later. She stood before he could introduce himself. "Jacob." He recognized neither her face nor her voice. "I'm sorry. My name is Eleanor Cross." The surname immediately captured his attention. Ethan Cross was my son. Jacob slowly invited her to sit. She placed an old leather folder on the table. I received your attorney's message. Margaret had apparently moved faster than expected. Jacob listened quietly. My son isn't dead. She spoke without emotion, only certainty. Jacob never interrupted. They buried someone else. I tried telling the investigators. No one believed me. She removed several faded photographs. Ethan, military service, corporate investigations, family gatherings. Then one recent photograph, taken only 6 months earlier. Ethan stood outside a rural gas station wearing a baseball cap. Older, gray at the temples, alive. Jacob stared at the picture. When was this taken? January. Where? Wyoming. Did you speak with him? No. He never lets me. Jacob frowned. What do you mean? Eleanor smiled sadly. He visits once every year. Only long enough to make sure I'm alive. Then he disappears again. Why? He says, her voice softened. Some people are safer if they never know where he is. Jacob understood. He thinks someone's hunting him. No. She shook her head. He says he's hunting someone else. The room became completely silent. Eleanor reached into the folder once more. My son told me something. If anyone ever came asking respectfully, she looked directly at Jacob. I should give them this. She handed him a sealed envelope. Written across the front were only 4 words. For the patient man. Jacob looked up. When did he give you this? 8 years ago. He said someone would eventually earn it. Not demand it. Earn it. Jacob carefully slipped the envelope into his briefcase without opening it. Eleanor noticed. You aren't curious. I am. Then why wait? Because it wasn't addressed to urgency. She smiled warmly. My son guessed correctly. Before leaving, she stopped beside the conference room door. Mr. Walker? Yes. Be careful. He isn't afraid for himself. He's afraid for whoever gets too close. After she left, Tyler entered. Everything okay? Jacob nodded. An old family matter. Tyler accepted the answer without another question. That evening, Jacob drove directly to Margaret's office. Charles was already there. He placed the envelope on the conference table. Margaret examined the handwriting. No postage. No fingerprints. Charles looked toward Jacob. You going to open it? Jacob waited until everyone sat down, then carefully sliced the seal with a letter opener. Inside rested only one sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, only a hand-drawn map. Charles immediately recognized it. I know this place. Jacob looked up. You do? It's an abandoned rail yard outside Pueblo. Margaret studied the map. A single red X marked one storage warehouse. Below appeared one sentence. Truth survives where ownership changes. No explanation, nothing else. Charles quietly leaned back. Ethan used old railroad depots for secure meetings. You've been there. Years ago. What was stored? Documents? Evidence? Backup records? Margaret immediately stood. We're going. Jacob checked his watch. Tonight? Absolutely. 3 hours later, they arrived outside the abandoned rail yard. Rusted tracks disappeared into darkness. Broken warehouses lined the property. Most had collapsed years earlier. Only one remained standing. The one marked with the red X. Charles carried a flashlight. Jacob examined the surroundings before approaching. No vehicles, no lights, no recent tire tracks. Margaret quietly photographed everything before entering. The warehouse smelled of dust and old timber. Broken windows allowed moonlight to spill across the cracked concrete floor. The map indicated the northwest corner. Jacob walked there first. Nothing. Only old crates. Charles suddenly stopped. Listen, Everyone froze. Faint footsteps echoed somewhere above them. Margaret switched off her flashlight. Silence. Then another sound. Metal scraping against metal. Jacob looked upward. A narrow catwalk stretched across the warehouse ceiling. Someone was moving. He spoke calmly. "We're not here to chase anyone." No answer. Another footstep. Charles whispered, "Left side." Jacob slowly climbed the steel staircase without rushing. Every step echoed. Halfway up, he noticed fresh dust disturbed along the railing. Someone had passed through recently. He reached the catwalk. Empty. Only darkness. Then he saw it. A small steel lockbox resting beneath a loose floor panel. He carefully lifted it. Unlocked. Inside were dozens of flash drives, paper files, photographs, property deeds, bank transfers, corporate ownership charts. Margaret stared in disbelief. "My God." Charles picked up one folder. His face hardened instantly. "I know these names." Jacob opened another file. One page immediately caught his attention. Glass River Realty Holdings. Ryan Caldwell's signature appeared repeatedly, not as owner, as recipient. Large consulting payments, millions of dollars, dating back nearly 9 years. Margaret quickly organized the documents. "Don't touch anything else." "We photograph everything first," Jacob nodded. "Evidence before conclusions. Always." As they prepared to leave, Jacob noticed one final object hidden beneath the lockbox. Another envelope. This one carried his full name, Jacob Walker. He opened it carefully. Inside rested a single handwritten sentence. "You've finally reached the beginning." At the bottom appeared a time. Tomorrow. 8:00 a.m. Union Station. Come alone. Jacob arrived at Denver Union Station at exactly 7:56 a.m. He carried nothing except his phone wallet and the folded note from the warehouse. No briefcase, no documents, no weapon. The station was already alive with commuters. Business travelers hurried toward the platforms with rolling luggage. Families gathered around departure boards. Coffee shops buzzed with quiet conversations. Jacob stood beneath the large mechanical clock exactly where the main concourse opened toward the tracks. He didn't search for suspicious faces. He simply observed patterns. People rushing, people waiting, people pretending not to watch anyone. At precisely 8 o'clock, a janitor pushing a cleaning cart slowed beside him. Without looking directly at Jacob, the elderly man quietly said, "Platform 7." Then he continued walking without stopping. Jacob never turned around. He simply walked toward Platform 7 at his normal pace, no faster, no slower. The platform was nearly empty. One regional train sat waiting with its doors still closed. An older man wearing a faded navy baseball cap sat alone on a wooden bench, reading yesterday's Wall Street Journal. Jacob recognized him immediately. The face had aged. Gray hair replaced black. Deep lines crossed his forehead. But the eyes remained alert. "Ethan Cross." The man slowly folded the newspaper. "I wondered how long it would take." Jacob sat beside him. Neither man offered a handshake. Neither introduced himself. After nearly 30 seconds, Ethan finally spoke. "You opened the warehouse." "Yes." "You brought anyone?" "I arrived alone." Ethan nodded once. "You follow instructions?" Jacob answered calmly. "I follow evidence." A faint smile crossed Ethan's face. "Charles chose well." Jacob looked towards the tracks. "You've known Charles for a long time?" "Long enough." The train horn sounded in the distance. Neither man moved. Jacob allowed Ethan to control the conversation. Patience had brought him this far. It would carry him farther. Finally, Ethan reached into his jacket and removed a sealed envelope. "No fingerprints. No names. No copies." He handed it to Jacob. "Read it after I leave." Jacob accepted it without opening it. "I have questions." "I know. So answer one." Ethan looked toward the arriving train. "Only one." Jacob chose carefully. "Why me?" Ethan smiled. Wrong question. The train doors opened. Passengers began boarding. Ethan remained seated. Jacob waited. You should have asked. Ethan stood. Why your wife? Then he boarded the train without looking back. Jacob remained on the platform until the train disappeared around the bend. Only then did he open the envelope. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a property transfer agreement. Glass River Realty Holdings. The seller, Blue Summit Development Corporation. The buyer, purchase amount, $148 million. Nothing unusual. Until Jacob saw the date. The agreement had been signed 9 years earlier, 3 weeks before Ryan Caldwell officially joined Glass River. The second document was more disturbing, a confidential consulting contract. Ryan Caldwell, Ethan Cross, retainer amount, $5 million, status, declined. Across the signature line, Ethan had handwritten one sentence, truth isn't for sale. Jacob quietly folded the paper. The third document was only a photograph. Ryan, standing beside another man. The man's face had been deliberately scratched away. Only one feature remained visible. A distinctive silver signet ring engraved with the letter H. Jacob immediately remembered something. Charles Whitaker wore an identical ring. Not the same ring, the same design. Family crest. He drove directly to Margaret Bennett's office. Charles was already reviewing the warehouse files. Jacob placed the photograph on the table. Charles's face immediately changed. He picked it up carefully. Where did you get this? Ethan. Charles stared at the scratched photograph. That's impossible. You recognize the ring? Charles nodded slowly. There were only 4. What? 4 Whitaker family rings. My father. My older brother. Myself. My son. Jacob looked directly at him. You have a son. Charles became unusually quiet. I had one. Margaret slowly lowered her pen. Charles continued. Henry Whitaker. Jacob remembered the engraved letter. H. Charles spoke almost to himself. He disappeared 14 years ago. No body. No ransom, no explanation. Margaret looked at the photograph again. You think this is Henry? Charles closed his eyes. I don't know. But if Ethan scratched out his face, he stopped. He wanted us to identify the ring ourselves. Jacob nodded. So we trust the clue. Not the conclusion. Margaret immediately contacted a forensic imaging specialist. Within hours, the damaged photograph underwent digital reconstruction. The scratched face could not be fully restored. But enough remained. Age estimate, mid-40s, height, approximately 6'2", scar above left eyebrow. Charles leaned closer. I remember that scar. Jacob waited. He got it falling from a horse. Silence settled over the room. Henry Whitaker might be alive. Meanwhile, Zoe's executive retreat reached its final day. Ryan announced the company's expansion plans before the assembled leadership team. One executive will relocate to Arizona. The position includes equity participation. Applause filled the ballroom. Ryan looked directly toward Zoe. We'll announce our selection next week. After the meeting, several executives congratulated her. One woman smiled warmly. I think you've already won, Zoe laughed. I hope so. Ryan approached carrying 2 glasses of champagne. You've earned this. She accepted one. I am not celebrating yet. You should. He raised his glass. To new beginnings. Their glasses touched. Across the ballroom, an elderly hotel employee quietly photographed the moment. Not secretly, openly. He appeared to be photographing decorations. Neither Ryan nor Zoe noticed. The employee later placed the phone inside his pocket and calmly walked away. By evening, the photograph had reached Margaret Bennett's secure email. Attached was only one sentence. Observed not interpreted. Margaret immediately forwarded it to Jacob. He looked at the image for less than 10 seconds, then deleted nothing. Saved everything. Evidence without assumptions. That evening, Charles invited Jacob to his private residence for the first time. The estate overlooked Cherry Hills Country Club. Elegant, quiet, old money. Charles led him into a library lined with leather-bound books. He unlocked a hidden cabinet behind one shelf. Inside rested dozens of family albums, photographs spanning nearly 60 years. He opened one marked 1998. There. Jacob saw a younger Charles. Beside him stood a man in his 20s, confident, athletic, wearing the same silver signet ring, Henry Whitaker. Jacob compared the family photograph with the reconstructed warehouse image. The resemblance was undeniable. Charles quietly closed the album. My son disappeared after disagreeing with me. What about business? He believed wealth should serve people. I believed people should earn wealth. Jacob listened carefully. We argued. He left. I never saw him again. Charles looked older than ever. I spent 14 years believing I drove him away. Jacob asked quietly, what if someone took advantage of that? Charles slowly looked toward him. Then I've wasted 14 years blaming myself. Margaret arrived shortly afterward, carrying another discovery. She placed an old corporate filing on the table. Blue Summit Development Corporation, original shareholders, Henry Whitaker, Ryan Caldwell. A third silent investor listed only by initials. E.C. Jacob immediately understood. Ethan. Margaret shook her head. No. She pointed carefully. The initials don't match his legal signature. Charles leaned closer. Elias Crane. Margaret nodded. Corporate attorney. Died 6 years ago. Jacob quietly absorbed another dead man entering the story, or supposedly dead. Margaret sighed. I'm beginning to dislike death certificates. Jacob almost smiled. So am I. Before anyone spoke again, Charles's private landline rang. Almost nobody possessed that number. He answered. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Charles's face slowly lost all color. Finally, he whispered, Henry. The line disconnected. Charles stared silently at the receiver. Jacob asked, What happened? Charles slowly lowered the phone. It was my son's voice. What did he say? Charles swallowed hard. Only 6 words. Jacob waited. Charles looked directly into his eyes. He knows who bought your future. Charles Whitaker remained motionless long after the call ended. The receiver still rested in his hand. His knuckles had turned white. Margaret quietly disconnected the line from the wall. Charles. He looked toward her but said nothing. What exactly did he sound like? Charles lowered himself into a leather chair. Older. Tired. But it was Henry. You have no doubt? None. Jacob remained standing beside the library window. He had watched people lie. He had watched people convince themselves of impossible things. This was neither. Charles wasn't remembering. He was recognizing. What were his exact words? Charles closed his eyes. He knows who bought your future. Jacob repeated the sentence silently. Not who destroyed your marriage. Not who manipulated Zoe. Who bought your future. The wording mattered. Everything in this investigation had been carefully worded. Nothing had been accidental. Margaret opened the warehouse files again. We've been looking at Ryan. Jacob nodded. And maybe we've been looking one level too low. Charles slowly leaned forward. If someone bought Jacob's future, he bought the company, or the contracts, or the people around them. Jacob suddenly remembered something Tyler had said weeks earlier. The engineering firm had unexpectedly lost 3 municipal bids, projects everyone expected them to win. Instead, each contract had gone to the same developer, Blue Summit Development. The name returned again, like a thread weaving through every piece of evidence. Jacob immediately called Tyler. "You busy?" "For you. Never. I need a favor." "What kind?" "I need every public bid Denver structural engineering lost to Blue Summit during the last 10 years. Tyler laughed softly. "You planning to sue somebody?" "No. I'm planning to understand somebody." Tyler stopped laughing. "I'll start now." Less than 2 hours later, the files arrived. 37 projects. Combined value, more than $2.8 billion. Jacob spread them across Charles's dining table. Margaret highlighted ownership records. Charles reviewed financing. Jacob studied timelines. Patterns slowly appeared. Every project had one thing in common. They weren't simply profitable. They were located exactly where future transportation corridors had later expanded. Blue Summit had somehow known years in advance which neighborhoods would explode in value. Charles quietly spoke. "That's impossible." Jacob shook his head. "No. Only expensive." Margaret understood immediately. "Insider planning documents." Charles nodded. "Someone inside state transportation." Jacob circled another date. "The purchases stopped." "When?" Margaret checked. 9 years ago. "The same year Ryan officially joined Glass River?" Charles looked toward Jacob. "Meaning?" "Meaning someone changed strategies. Instead of buying land, someone had started buying people." Jacob leaned back. "Including Zoe. Including executives. Including consultants. Including political influence. Not through threats, through opportunity, through ambition, through carefully designed promotions. Everything suddenly felt larger than a marriage. Much larger." Late that afternoon, Zoe returned to Denver. She expected Jacob to ask about Arizona. He never did. Instead, he greeted her at the front door exactly as he always had. "How was the conference?" "Busy." "Dinner?" "I already ate." "Long day." "Very." She walked upstairs carrying her overnight bag. Jacob watched quietly, not suspicious, simply observant. She never mentioned Ryan, never mentioned the champagne toast, never mentioned the executive announcement. She simply disappeared into the bedroom. 15 minutes later, she came downstairs wearing comfortable clothes. Jacob had already prepared tea. She looked surprised. "You remembered." "You always drink chamomile after travel." She accepted the mug. For one brief moment, guilt crossed her face. Small, almost invisible. Jacob noticed it, but he never reacted. She asked, "How was your week?" "Productive." "Anything interesting happened?" He answered honestly. "I met someone everyone believed was dead." She laughed. "I mean at work." "I know." He smiled slightly. "So do I." She didn't understand the answer. That night after Zoe had gone to sleep, Jacob drove to Margaret's office. She had been waiting. "So?" she asked. "About what?" "Anything interesting happen?" Margaret smiled. "And I told the truth?" She laughed quietly. "You're becoming dangerous." "No. I'm becoming precise." Margaret placed another folder on the desk. Private banking records, obtained legally through subpoena authority connected to another ongoing investigation. Ryan Caldwell's personal accounts. Large deposits, regular, structured, always arriving from shell corporations. Jacob studied the transfers. The amounts varied, but the intervals did not. Every 90 days, like a salary, not ownership distributions. Someone wasn't paying Ryan for success. Someone was paying him to continue. Margaret tapped one account number. "The money eventually traces here." Jacob looked closer. Helios Strategic Holdings. No public ownership. No executive list. No office address. only a registered corporate agent in Delaware. Charles entered moments later carrying another surprise. "I found Helios." Both looked up. "My family office almost invested with them 15 years ago." "What happened?" Charles smiled bitterly. "They refused due diligence. No financial disclosure. No board meetings. No site visits." Jacob frowned. "And people invested anyway." Charles nodded. "Very wealthy people." "How wealthy?" Charles quietly answered. "Billionaires who preferred anonymity." Margaret stared at him. "Helios isn't buying companies." Charles nodded. "It's buying influence." The room became silent. Jacob slowly connected another piece. What if Helios bought Blue Summit? What if Blue Summit bought Glass River? What if Ryan never owned anything? Margaret completed the thought. He only managed it. Charles looked toward Jacob. "Which means someone else bought your future." Exactly as Henry had warned. At sunrise the following morning, Jacob received another message. No sender, only an address. Old Denver Federal Courthouse. Courtroom 3, 10:00 a.m., come without attorneys. Margaret immediately objected. "It's a trap," Jacob agreed. "Probably." "Then don't go." "I have to." "Why?" "Because whoever keeps contacting me," he folded the paper, "has never once lied." Charles insisted on following anyway. Jacob refused. "If I'm being watched." "They expect me alone," Margaret reluctantly agreed. "But you're wearing this." She handed him a pen, ordinary black ink. Inside it hid an encrypted audio transmitter. Jacob clipped it into his shirt pocket. At 9:57 a.m., he entered the abandoned courthouse. Dust covered the marble floors. Sunlight poured through broken stained glass windows. Courtroom 3 stood open, empty. Rows of wooden benches stretched toward the judge's podium. Jacob walked inside. No movement, no voices, only silence. Then applause echoed from the rear balcony. Slow, measured. One pair of hands. Jacob turned. A tall man stepped from the shadows. Mid-40s, athletic, gray suit, silver signet ring, scar above his left eyebrow. Henry Whitaker. He descended the staircase calmly, stopping 15 feet away. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Henry smiled. "My father still trusts too easily." Jacob remained expressionless. "And you?" "I trust evidence." Henry nodded approvingly. "Ethan was right about you. So was Charles." Henry glanced around the empty courtroom. "I've spent 14 years preparing for this conversation." Jacob answered quietly. "I've spent 2 weeks." Henry almost laughed. "And you're already here." He slowly removed a thick, sealed folder from his coat. "I could hand this to the FBI. I could hand it to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I could hand it to the Department of Justice." He looked directly into Jacob's eyes. "But I'm handing it to you." Jacob accepted nothing. "Why?" "Because they would prosecute." "You will understand." Henry stepped closer. "Your marriage," he paused, "was never the objective." Jacob's expression never changed. "It was collateral." Henry held out the folder again. "This explains everything." Jacob finally accepted it. The folder felt surprisingly heavy. Dozens of documents, photographs, corporate records, handwritten journals. Henry took one slow step backward. "When you finish reading," he looked towards the broken judge's bench, "you'll understand why your wife laughed at one suitcase." Jacob looked up. "And why was that?" Henry's voice became almost sorrowful. "Because someone had already packed your entire life." Jacob did not open the folder inside the abandoned courthouse. He simply looked at Henry Whitaker for several quiet seconds. "If everything inside this folder is true," Jacob said calmly, "why disappear for 14 years? Henry looked toward the empty judge's bench. because 14 years ago I didn't have proof. And now I have enough to end it. Jacob still held the folder at his side. You could have handed this to federal investigators years ago. Henry slowly shook his head. No. They would have found fragments. I needed the whole machine. Jacob watched him carefully. Henry wasn't trying to convince him. He was stating conclusions that had already cost him half his life. You're trusting me. I'm trusting your habits. My habits? You verify before you believe. Henry gave a faint smile. Most people choose sides. You collect evidence. He turned toward the courtroom exit. That's why you're still alive. Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly. What does that mean? Henry stopped without turning around. The first 3 people who started asking these questions died in accidents. Then he walked away. Jacob neither followed him nor called out. He simply waited until Henry's footsteps disappeared before leaving through another exit. By noon, he was sitting inside Margaret Bennett's conference room. Charles sat opposite him. The sealed folder rested untouched between them. Margaret spoke first. We open it together. Jacob nodded. No assumptions. Charles carefully cut the seal. Inside were 6 separate binders. Each had a typed label: land, people, banks, media, politics, insurance. Margaret looked at Jacob. This isn't a company. Jacob quietly answered, it's an ecosystem. They began with land. Property purchases. Thousands of acres. Acquired years before highways, hospitals, technology campuses, or airports were announced publicly. Each purchase traced through shell corporations. Eventually, every trail disappeared into Helios Strategic Holdings. Next came people. Executive recruitment files. Performance reviews. Psychological profiles. Private financial vulnerabilities. Marriage records. Divorce settlements. Promotion histories. Jacob slowly turned another page. Every executive had been assigned a risk score: loyalty, debt, ambition, ego, predictability. He stopped. There. Employee profile. Zoe Walker. Corporate Communications Director. Ambition Index 9.4. Financial pressure low. Public image sensitivity high. Recruitment probability excellent. Jacob never blinked. He simply kept reading. There was no romance, no secret relationship, no surveillance photos, only corporate behavioral analysis. Margaret leaned closer. They profiled her. Charles quietly added, they profiled everyone. Jacob continued. Recommendation: increase public visibility. Offer accelerated executive track. Assign direct mentor, Ryan Caldwell. Margaret looked at him. Ryan wasn't seducing her. He was managing an assignment. Jacob remained silent. The sentence settled heavily across the room. Everything Zoe believed she had earned might have been carefully engineered. Charles slowly opened the 3rd binder. Banks, private financing, political donations, construction loans, insurance settlements. Every transaction circled back toward Helios. 4th binder, media, business magazines, award nominations, television interviews, industry rankings. Even public recognition had apparently been purchased years in advance. Jacob remembered the magazine featuring Ryan, the carefully crafted image, the interviews, the speeches. Perhaps none of them had been accidental. Margaret reached the 5th binder. Politics, state transportation officials, city council campaign donations, infrastructure planning committees, lobbying groups. Nothing obviously illegal. Everything carefully separated, perfectly documented, perfectly insulated. Charles finally whispered, they built influence legally. Jacob nodded. They only crossed lines where nobody could see. The final binder remained. Insurance. At first it appeared unrelated. Life insurance, corporate indemnity policies, executive disability coverage. But halfway through the binder, Jacob stopped. There. Operation Continuity. A confidential contingency plan. If key executives became unavailable, replacement candidates had already been identified years in advance. Ryan Caldwell. Replacement identified. 3 names. Zoe Walker ranked first. Margaret slowly lowered the page. Oh my God. Charles stared silently. Jacob looked again. Promotion timeline? Estimated activation within 18 months. Exactly matching Ryan's Arizona expansion announcement. The promotion had been scheduled before Zoe had even begun competing for it. Jacob finally leaned back. His breathing remained steady. No anger, no triumph, only clarity. Everything she believed she had achieved had already been purchased. Margaret quietly asked, "What are you thinking?" Jacob answered honestly, "I'm wondering whether she ever had a choice." Silence filled the room. Charles spoke carefully. "Choice always exists." Jacob nodded. "So does manipulation." Later that afternoon, Jacob returned home. Zoe sat at the kitchen island answering emails. She smiled politely. "You're home early." "So are you." She closed her laptop. "We need to talk." Jacob took a seat across from her. "About Arizona." She hesitated. "Ryan recommended me." "I know." Her eyebrows lifted. "You know." "He announced it publicly." She relaxed. "I haven't accepted." "I know." She looked surprised again. Jacob poured himself a glass of water. No accusations. No confrontation, only questions. "Did you ever wonder why promotions came so quickly?" Zoe laughed softly. "I worked hard." "You did." And someone noticed." Jacob nodded. "They certainly did." She watched him carefully. Something about his calmness unsettled her. Usually difficult conversations contained tension. This one contained none. She finally asked, "Is something wrong?" Jacob looked directly at her. "Do you trust Ryan?" She answered almost immediately. "Professionally." "Personally?" She hesitated. "I don't know him personally." Jacob accepted the answer. "Fair enough." She leaned forward. "Why are you asking?" Instead of answering, Jacob asked another question. "When was the first time Ryan contacted you outside work?" She searched her memory. 3 years ago. Leadership conference. He said I had executive potential." Jacob nodded slowly, exactly matching the recruitment timeline. She continued, "He introduced me to important people. He encouraged graduate leadership courses. He recommended board presentations. He never crossed boundaries." Jacob believed her. Nothing in Henry's files suggested Ryan had. Manipulation didn't require romance, only direction. Jacob quietly stood. "I'm making dinner." She looked confused. "That's it. That's enough for tonight." She watched him move around the kitchen. For the first time in months, she seemed uncertain, not defensive, not angry, simply uncertain. Across town, Ryan Caldwell entered Helios Tower. Unlike Glass River headquarters, this building had no company logo, no public reception, no directory, only private security. He rode directly to the 31st floor. An older woman waited inside a minimalist office overlooking downtown Denver. Silver hair, black suit, no decorations, only windows. She never invited him to sit. "You've lost control." Ryan remained standing. "We're managing it." She slid a photograph across the desk. Jacob leaving the abandoned courthouse, Henry visible in the background. Ryan's face tightened. "Impossible." The woman folded her hands. "Nothing is impossible. Only expensive." Ryan looked at the photograph again. "How much does he know?" The woman answered without emotion. "Enough." "And Henry, he made his choice." Ryan slowly looked up. "What are your instructions?" The woman walked toward the window. "For 20 years we've purchased futures." She paused. "We've never allowed anyone to sell them back." Ryan understood immediately. He spoke quietly. You want Jacob removed. She looked back at him. No. A faint smile crossed her face. I want Jacob offered something better. Ryan frowned. He won't take it. The woman continued watching the city below. Everyone has a price. At that exact moment across Denver, Jacob finished preparing dinner. He placed 2 plates on the table. Zoe smiled weakly. This feels normal. Jacob looked at her with quiet honesty. Normal ended a long time ago. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. 1 text message. Tomorrow. 9:00 a.m. Helios Strategic Holdings wishes to make you an offer. Jacob slowly locked the screen. Across the table, Zoe noticed only one thing. For the first time since packing that single suitcase, Jacob wasn't reacting to what happened around him. He was expecting it. Jacob arrived at Helios Strategic Holdings at exactly 8:58 a.m. The building remained as anonymous as ever. No logo, no directory, no indication that billions of dollars in influence had quietly passed through its walls for decades. The receptionist already knew his name. Mr. Walker. She smiled politely. They're expecting you. She escorted him to the same 31st floor Ryan Caldwell had visited the day before. The older woman stood beside the window overlooking Denver. She turned only after the door closed. Mr. Walker. Jacob nodded. You asked to meet. I did. She motioned toward a chair. I hope you'll hear me before making any decisions. Jacob remained standing. I'll listen. Nothing more. She appreciated the answer. My name is Eleanor Pierce. I founded Helios Strategic Holdings 26 years ago. You've probably imagined something darker, Jacob answered evenly. I don't imagine. I verify. A faint smile crossed her face. Henry was right. She walked to a long conference table. Several folders already waited there. You believe we destroyed your life? Jacob corrected her. I believe someone attempted to control it. She inclined her head. A better description. She opened the first folder. Inside were photographs of abandoned factories, bankrupt construction companies, and empty neighborhoods from decades earlier. We acquired distressed assets. We rebuilt cities. We financed infrastructure. We saved businesses banks had already abandoned. Jacob said nothing. She continued. But we also learned something. The greatest investment wasn't property. It was people. She slid another file toward him. We identified future leaders before anyone else did. We funded them. We promoted them. We accelerated careers. Jacob glanced at the documents. Everything matched Henry's evidence. Only the interpretation differed. You profiled them. We evaluated them. You manipulated them. We created opportunity. Jacob finally sat down. And if someone declined, Eleanor answered without hesitation, they remained exactly where they already were. Jacob held her gaze. So every choice was engineered. She calmly replied, every opportunity is engineered. She leaned forward. You've mistaken influence for force. Jacob quietly opened another folder. His own name appeared. Jacob Walker. Leadership potential exceptional. Integrity index, maximum. Predictability, minimal. Recommended acquisition difficult. He looked up. You evaluated me. Years ago. And you couldn't be purchased. So you targeted my wife. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Finally, she said, we approached the person most likely to accept advancement. Jacob absorbed the sentence. Not emotionally, factually. Across every page, every chart, every financial model. He saw one consistent belief. People could be priced. Not always with money. Sometimes with recognition. Sometimes with promotion. Sometimes with fear. sometimes with ambition. Everything had a value. Everything except one thing: character. Jacob quietly closed the file. You made one mistake. Eleanor folded her hands. Which one? You assumed integrity behaves like an asset. She smiled. It usually does. No, it behaves like a boundary. For the first time, her expression changed, only slightly. You came because you wanted something. Jacob reached into his briefcase. I did. He placed a small digital recorder onto the table. Then another. Then another. Finally, he placed a federal search warrant. Eleanor looked at it without moving. The conference room door opened. Margaret Bennett entered first. Behind her came 2 attorneys from the Department of Justice. 3 FBI financial investigators followed. Charles Whitaker walked in last. No one spoke. Margaret addressed Eleanor. The warrant authorizes seizure of all physical and electronic records relating to undisclosed ownership structures, securities fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy. Ryan Caldwell stepped into the hallway behind them. His face lost all color. He stared at Jacob. You planned this. Jacob looked at him calmly. No. I documented it. Ryan laughed bitterly. You think this changes anything? Jacob answered. I think evidence changes everything. The investigators immediately began securing computers, filing cabinets, encrypted drives, and financial ledgers. Eleanor remained perfectly composed. She never resisted. She simply watched. You still don't understand, she said quietly. Jacob asked, What don't I understand? We're replaceable. She nodded toward the windows overlooking the city. There will always be another Helios. Jacob answered with the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. Maybe. But every system becomes weaker when people stop believing it's untouchable. An investigator approached Ryan. Mr. Caldwell, we'll need you to remain available for questioning. Ryan looked toward Eleanor. She gave no instructions, no reassurance, nothing. For the first time, he understood he had never been a partner, only another asset, another profile, another replaceable investment. 3 months later, Denver. Glass River Holdings announced sweeping leadership changes. Ryan Caldwell resigned before formal charges were filed. Several board members stepped down. Independent compliance officers assumed temporary control. The Arizona expansion continued under new management. Zoe received another promotion offer. This one arrived after an independent review. No recommendations, no hidden sponsors, no secret mentor, only documented performance. She carried the letter home and placed it in front of Jacob. I almost turned it down. Jacob looked at the envelope. Why? I needed to know it was actually mine. He smiled gently. And now? She nodded. Now I know. Their divorce proceedings had also quietly concluded. No public accusations, no courtroom drama, only honesty. They had both signed the papers weeks earlier, not because hatred remained, because trust no longer did. Zoe looked at him across the kitchen table. I kept trying to figure out when I lost you. Jacob answered softly. You didn't lose me. We simply stopped walking toward the same future. Tears gathered in her eyes. I never meant to become that person. Jacob believed her. Some people chose betrayal. Others slowly drifted toward it without realizing how far they had gone. Intent and consequence were rarely identical. I hope you find peace, he said. She nodded. I hope you do too. She left carrying only 2 boxes. Jacob watched from the doorway. Months earlier, he had packed 1 suitcase. Now the entire house felt lighter. Not emptier, lighter. Spring arrived in Colorado. Jacob reopened the engineering consulting practice under a new name. Walker Infrastructure Advisory, smaller, independent, transparent. Tyler became his business partner. Margaret remained outside legal counsel. Charles Whitaker invested quietly, but refused any executive title. "I'm retired," he insisted. "You've said that 12 times, Tyler laughed, "and I'll keep saying it." Henry Whitaker never returned to public life. He disappeared again after providing testimony. One morning, Jacob found a handwritten envelope in his office mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single note. "Some futures are bought. Others are built. Thank you for proving the difference. H.W." Jacob folded the note carefully. He placed it inside the drawer where he kept only the things that mattered. Not contracts, not awards, not financial statements, only reminders. Late that afternoon, he drove toward the mountains outside Denver. The same old pickup truck climbed the winding road. He stopped at an overlook. Snow still rested on distant peaks. The city shimmered below. His phone remained silent. No emergency meetings, no anonymous messages, no investigations. Only quiet. He thought back to the morning Zoe had laughed as he packed one suitcase. At the time, everyone believed he was leaving with almost nothing. The truth had been exactly the opposite. He had left carrying the only things no one else could purchase: his patience, his discipline, his judgment, his name. Everything else had simply been furniture. Jacob smiled to himself. The future Eleanor Pierce believed could be bought had never belonged to Helios. It had always belonged to the person willing to build it honestly. The wind moved gently through the pine trees. Jacob started the engine. Then he drove toward the road ahead. Not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer determined where he was going. Sometimes the most valuable thing a person owns isn't a house, a title, a bank account, or even a relationship. It's the ability to remain steady when everything else is trying to pull them off course. Jacob never won because he shouted louder than everyone else. He won because he refused to trade truth for convenience and evidence for emotion. Quiet preparation accomplished what anger never could. Real life often presents smaller versions of the same choice. People may underestimate you, overlook you, or assume they know your worth based on appearances. In those moments, the strongest response is rarely immediate revenge. It is consistent character, careful thinking, and the patience to let truth reveal itself over time. What is built on integrity lasts far longer than what is built on manipulation. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone underestimated you, only to discover later that they were completely wrong? Share your story in the comments. I would genuinely love to read it and hear how you handled it. If this story stayed with you until the very end, subscribe and join us again tomorrow for another unforgettable story about quiet strength, unexpected justice, and the choices that shape a person's future.